Section 1 of Astounding Stories 14, February 1931. By Various. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Astounding Stories 14, February 1931. Werewolves of War by D. W. Hall. Part A. Trapped again. But this time, Lance swore, they'd not get away without paying dearly for it. Under the mesh of his gas mask, the lean lines of his jaw went taut. Tense, steely fingers flipped to the knobbed control instruments. The gleaming single-seater scout plane catapulted in a screaming somersault. Lance's ever-wary sixth sense told him the tongues of disintegrating flame had licked the plane's protected belly. And for the fact that it was protected he thanked again his stupendous luck. He pulled savagely at the squat control stick. The four Rahl Diesels unleashed a torrent of power, and the slim scout rose like a comet, and hurtled, the altitude dial's nervous finger proclaimed, to 10,000 feet. Lance eased off the power, relaxed slightly, and glanced below. They'd started off a squadron of 15 planes. 13 had crumpled beneath that treacherous, stabbing curtain of disintegrating flame. Only 2 of them were left, he and Praed. Praed, of course. The fellow's plane was pirouetting nearby. Lance was the squadron leader. He jammed his thin-lipped mouth close to the mike and rasped. "They trapped us again. There's some damn spy at our base. Stand by, Praed. They'll send up a few men to wipe us out, too, and we're going to square the account." He listened for Praed's answer. Presently it came. "I can't. They got 2 of my motors. I'm limping badly. We'd better beat it while we can." Lance's mouth curled. He roared, "Go on then, beat it, but I'm going to take a couple of 'em anyway." Disgusted, filled with red anger, he flung the phones from his head, watched Praed's plane whirl its stubby nose for home, settled himself alertly in the low, padded seat, and concentrated his attention on the ground below. He'd been right. Tiny, gray-clad figures were pouring from their barracks, rushing madly towards the dozen or so planes neatly drawn up on the field. Lance's mouth twitched. They probably wondered, down there, why the devil he didn't beat it, like Praed. He stroked the lever which controlled his 5 gas bombs, centered his battery of incendiary bullet machine guns, and ruthlessly shoved the control stick full over. The Rahl Diesels pumped at full power. His plane plummeted downwards with the speed of light, a hurtling shell of steel. His unexpected move took the men below by surprise. Lance knew they needed at least 10 minutes to prepare another salvo of disintegrating flame. He had about 4 minutes left. There was a restless, thudding chatter, and his bullets began to mow them down. Lance could see the horrified expressions of the men beneath, and chuckled grimly as they sought to escape the wrath of his hot guns. He flung bursts of spouting, acid-filled lead at the defenseless planes, and saw 2 of them collapse in shrouds of acrid white smoke. And still he dove. At a bare 100 feet he tugged the control stick back, and the tiny scout groaned under the pull of her motors. Then her snout jolted upwards. Lance pounded the gas bomb lever, and smiled a tight smile as he sensed the 5 pills sloping down from their compartment in the scout's belly. A second later came a rolling, ear-numbing crash. Lance, safe at a perch of a few thousand feet, grinned as his narrowed eyes beheld the sticky curtain of death-crammed gas hug over the empty base. "That'll quiet 'em for a few minutes," he muttered savagely. A few minutes, but not more. And he had no more bombs. His ammunition belts were nearly depleted. "I guess," he murmured, "I'd better follow that quitter Praed. I've paid 'em for the boys they got, anyway." He leveled the plane out, threw a last glance at the carpet of gas he had laid, and spurred the purring Rahl Diesels to their limit. His speed dial flashed round to 500, 550, 70, and finally rested quivering at the scout's full 600 miles per hour. Under the streamlined plane's speeding body, the gnarled, bomb-torn terrain of Nevada hurtled by. A rather sad frown creased Lance's prematurely old brow as he glimpsed it. Thousands of lives had been thrown into that ground, The hot, tumbled waste was doused with freely sacrificed blood. The blood of whole regiments of America's heroic First Home Army. Martyred men. Lance couldn't help swearing to himself at the bitter thought of that terrible reckoning day. It was the price his country had paid for her continued ignoring of the festering peril overseas. Slaughtered like sheep, those glorious regiments had been. Helpless almost before the ultra-modern war weapons of the United Slav hordes, they'd stopped the numbingly quick advance merely by the weight of their bodies. Like Little Belgium in 1914. They'd held the Slavs to California, ravished, war-desolated California. The thin front line trenches far behind, Lance began a slanting dive that raised his speed well over 600. Through the front magnifying mirror, he spied the squat khaki buildings of his base. Werewolves of War, the batch of planes he belonged to had been christened, and it was a richly deserved title. In front of the front they fought, detailed to desperate, harrying missions, losing an average of 10 men a day. The ordeal of gas and fire and acid bullets added 5 years to a man's brow overnight, if he served with the werewolves of war. Lance was only 24, but his hair was splotched with dead gray strands, his eyes were hard and weary, his face lined with new wrinkles. Ah, well, it was war. And a losing war, he had to admit, that they fought. If a miracle didn't come, America would crumble even as old Europe had, before the overwhelming Slavish troops. Even now, as Lance knew through various rumors, the Slavs were massed for a grand attack. And with what could America hold them back? His helicopter props spun, and the scout nestled down lightly on the tarmac. Lance switched off the faithful Rahl diesels, swung open the tiny door, and leaped from the enclosed cockpit. "Sir," he rapped to thin, stern-browed Colonel Douglas, "there's no longer any doubt in my mind. This is the 5th time we've been anticipated. Trapped. The enemy is informed directly of the attacking plans of our scout details. There's a spy at this base." He lowered his eyes for a second and said in a queer tone of voice, 13 of 'em went down today." Colonel Douglas' tired face showed the never-ceasing strain he was under. He clasped his hands behind his back, took a few nervous turns up and down the small office, and finally, with a somewhat hopeless sigh, muttered, "I know, Lance, I know. The devils, they seem to be aware of everything we plan. Yet what can we do? Look at the territory our front lines cover. More than 2,000 miles of loosely held ground. And we're so damnably organized, man. Look here." He strode to the huge map, which covered entirely one wall of the little room, and ran his forefinger down the long red line, signifying the American front, which stretched crookedly from the Canadian border to the Gulf of California. Parallel to it was another line, of black, the United Slavs. "It's so damned easy," Colonel Douglas said, "for a spy to slip over." He sighed again. "I fought in the scrap of 1917 as a kid of 20. It was different then. But this is 1938, and it's a scientific war we're trying to fight." He sat down in his swivel chair. How did they wipe you out today?" "That blasted disintegrating flame again," Lance told him swiftly. "It's obvious, Colonel. How did the Slavs know we were going to raid that comparatively unimportant base of theirs at such and such a time? They had the flame shooters all ready for us, and at a place where they've never had them before. We came up at 25,000 feet, dropped down in a full power dive, and—" he gestured wildly. "Biff! The flames caught us neatly at the regulation 1,000 feet. They got 13 men. Only 2 got away, Praed and myself." His keen eyes were inquiring, and the colonel interpreted their look correctly. "Praed," he murmured. "Yes, I saw him come back by himself. He said you were following. 2 of his motors were shot. He seems to bear a charmed life, doesn't he?" Lance nodded. He didn't like to hint at the thought he had in mind. It seemed a cowardly, stab-in-the-back thing to do. Yet it was duty, and there was no questioning duty. "I've never seen Praed shoot down an enemy plane," he said slowly. "This is the 5th time we've been ambushed, and Praed's never been caught. Somehow, he's always seemed to be aware of what was coming." "You mean?" the colonel questioned. Lance shook his head. I don't want to commit myself, Colonel Douglas, but I'm suggesting that we, well, keep our eyes peeled, and perhaps watch certain members of the outfit more closely." Douglas rose as his orderly Ranth came into the room. "Find Lieutenant Praed for me," the colonel ordered crisply. Then, turning to Lance, he said, "You'd better knock off a few hours' sleep. You are worn out." Lance watched the orderly Ranth salute and leave. Ranth was heavy, thick-built, with closely set eyes. The young squadron leader was suddenly conscious that he was, as the colonel said, worn out. His limbs seemed leaden, his eyelids heavy. "I think you're right, sir," he murmured, and walked out onto the field. Seeing Praed's machine drawn up with the overall-clad figure of a mechanic fussing at its motors, he wandered over to survey it. The Scout was an exact replica of his, a model of the famous Goshawk type. It was all motor, everything being sacrificed to speed. On either side of the stubby brow of the fuselage, which held the death-dealing battery of 3 machine guns, were set the 4 Rahl diesel motors, back to back. The pilot's tiny enclosed cockpit was thus surrounded by engines. In the V-shaped, smooth-lined wings were the 2 helicopter props. Further back, inside the steel-sheathed, bullet-like fuselage, the radio outfit and fuel tanks. The craft's rounded belly covered the gas bomb compartment. The mechanic was a little Cockney Englishman, a fugitive, like all his countrymen, from the horror which had stricken England suddenly and left her wallowing in her life blood. He looked up at Lance, and a smile broke forth on his wizened, sharp little face. "It's got me beat, sir," he said in his curious, twanging voice. "Lieutenant Praed, 'e says to me, 'Somethin' wrong with 2 of me motors,' 'e says. 'They quit on me quite sudden like. Look 'em over, will you?' 'e says. So I been lookin' 'em over. But they ain't nothin' wrong with the bloody things, sir. Nothin' at all." "It does seem funny, doesn't it, Wells?" Lance said levelly. He'd known it all along. Praed was a quitter, a yellow belly, besides being... But he stopped there. He had no definite proof. It was unjust to accuse a man of that without definite, positive proof. The little mechanic muttered some mysterious Cockney curse, and then said in an admiring tone, "'Ow many of the swine's plane have you shot down now, sir?" "About 20, I think," Lance told him gruffly. The Cockney shot his breath out with a whistle. "Cripes! You'll be up to that there Captain Hay soon if you keeps it up, sir." Lance laughed. Hay, the almost legendary hero of the American Air Force, who had shot down, so latest rumors said, 50 Slav planes, was far above him. "I'll never reach Hay's record, Wells. I'll be doing pretty well if I bag half as many." Then, seeing Ranth, the orderly, followed by Praed, he strode quickly away and came face to face with the latter. For a moment the 2 men eyed each other, a taut silence between them. Praed's thin, sun-blackened countenance was immovable, mask-like. His blue-green eyes met Lance's steadily. Finally Lance snorted and burst out, "Why the hell did you run away, Praed? Scared stiff?" Praed's low voice, devoid of all trace of emotion, asked, "What makes you think I was scared, Lance?" "You know damn well what makes me think it. That lousy crack about your motors being shot." "2 of my motors were limping." Lance gave a sarcastic chuckle. "Ask Wells about that, why don't you? He's got a few ideas on the subject." Praed repeated, "2 of my motors were limping," and abruptly he turned away, leaving Lance fuming, and went into Colonel Douglas's office. What would Douglas say to him? Accuse him outright of his suspicions? Put him under arrest as a spy? But he couldn't do that. There was, after all, no proof. Lance swore to himself. Then, feeling a wave of weariness surge over him, went to the shack he was quartered in, kicked off his battered boots, stripped away his Sam Browne, and flung his lean body out on the hard, gray sheeted cot. Seconds later he was lost in the sleep that comes to the physically exhausted. The desperate situation America was in, the whole savage war, everything faded from his mind. But to right and left of that cot stretched others, empty. The brave squadron Lance had led into the blue sky that morning now lay charred skeletons around the flame flowers that had struck them down. And in a dozen other aircraft bases behind the hard-pressed lines were other empty cots. Time and time again the Slav planes shot down 2 to the Americans' 1. Time and time again the treacherous, disintegrating flames, the weapon which baffled America's scientists, had struck down whole squadrons that had been lured into traps, even as Lance's had been lured. And even the Slav forces pushed forward. End of Part A. Section 2 of Astounding Stories 14, February 1931. By Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Werewolves of War, by D. W. Hall. Part B. "You're wanted by Colonel Douglas, sir." Lance felt a hand jarring his shoulder. He turned sleepily over, yawned, and stared up into the dark, full-cheeked face of Ranth, the orderly. "Huh? Colonel Douglas wants you," repeated Ranth. "It's 5 o'clock, sir." Wearily, Lance pulled on his boots and adjusted the military belt. The night was hot and sticky. Somewhere, miles to the rear of the base, the batteries of long-distance guns were beginning their nightly serenade. Lance followed the orderly's broad, chunky back to the colonel's office. The colonel gazed up with tired eyes from the welter of maps on his desk. "Lance," he said, "I'm changing the routine of the night patrol. A fresh batch of youngsters came in this afternoon to fill the empty files. 24 new planes arrived by transport, too. I'm sending 10 of them over for the night patrol. Stevens will take your place. I've got another errand for you. And Prod." Lance was conscious that Ranth was standing quietly behind the colonel's chair. Douglas ordered him to attend to some errand, and the orderly left. "I had an interview with Prod," the colonel went on. "I didn't exactly accuse him of anything definite, but I think I threw a bit of a scare into him. Tonight, we'll give him the acid test. You and he will fly over tonight to investigate Hill 333. There have been rumors that the Slavs are massing there, and we want positive information. There's sure to be a fight. Watch Prod carefully. If he steers clear of any scrapping, we'll have enough to court-martial him on. Understand?" Lance nodded. "Right. It's a dangerous errand, Lance, but I'm confident you'll come through as always. There's no one else who could handle the job. God, man, you're getting close to Hay's record. You'll be the top-notcher of the service soon." The young man laughed briefly. "No danger of that. When do we take off, sir?" Douglas consulted his watch. 7:15. Come and get the dope from these maps. Hill 333's rather difficult to find. "Anything been happening at the front, sir?" The colonel passed both fine-fingered hands over his lined face. He said quietly, "Yes. The Slavs took 25 miles from us down in the lower sector. Just wiped our boys out. Those damnable flamethrowers and bulletproof tanks, supported by God knows how many hundreds of planes. It's hell, Lance. Headquarters thinks they're going to unleash a general attack all along the line in the next few days. And our resources, well, our backs against the wall. We're coming to death grips, man." 7:15. Lance pressed the starting button. His 4 motors choked, sputtered, then burst into a sweet, full-throated roar. He glanced over at Prod's plane, spun the small helicopter props over, and pushed down the accelerator. The plane quivered, stuck its snout up, and leaped like an arrow into the clean, darkening air. Lance gunned it to 10,000 feet, Prod following him neatly. Prod was a good pilot, no doubt about that. The 2 fighting machines hung for a second side by side. Lance eased off his helicopters and streaked away into the gloom at a breathtaking 500. "I hope," muttered Colonel Douglas as the 2 tiny scouts sped from sight, "that everything goes smoothly. They're the men to do it, anyway. No better pilots in the whole service." "What about that there Captain Hay, sir?" put in Wells, the mechanic, standing nearby. Colonel Douglas smiled. "Oh, of course," he amended. "I'd forgotten Hay." Once more they were anticipated. Lance, at 30,000 feet, the Rahl diesels, with their perfected superchargers, were easily capable of a ceiling of 60, had hovered above the position of Hill 333, pulled on his gas mask, and said through the microphone to Prod, "Power dive to 3,000 feet. Release your flares and take in all you can before they send up planes. We'll take 'em by surprise, but there's bound to be a fight. Got it?" The steady reply came back. "Okay." Whereat Lance set his teeth in his customary fighting grin, jockeyed up his ammunition belts, glanced at the flare parachutes folded alongside the cabin, and plunged the scout in a dive that tipped 650 miles and threatened to crack the speed dial. But surprise? Nothing doing. Like angry hornets, 5 Slav planes pounced on them at 10,000 feet. They'd been waiting there. Lance cursed savagely. He flung off his flares, Immelmanned up, and in less than 2 seconds had sent one Slav shrieking to the ground in flames. For the moment forgetting Praed, Lance followed after his flares, 3 Slavs attempting to sight their guns on the twisting, writhing, corkscrewing body of his Goshawk. He knew there were disintegrating flame throwers below, but gambled on their not shooting because of the enemy scouts diving with him. Flattening out at perhaps 1,000 feet, Lance threw a rapid stare at the bulk of Hill 333. He drew his breath in sharply. Lit dazzlingly by the bleaching white of the slow-floating flares, huge rows of the dreaded Slav tanks were clustered all around the hill. As he looked, 10 more Slav planes came soaring up from the ground. This was too hot. The thought of Praed stabbed through Lance's whirling brain. He pulled the scout around, doubled over the 3 closing in on his tail, and belched lead for an instant at one he'd caught off guard. It collapsed like a punctured paper bag. Lance grinned and bounded to the upper regions. The 2 other Slavs let the crazy Yank go for the instant, joining forces with the 10 brothers coming to help them out. Lance, again at 10,000, looked for Praed. Far above, he glimpsed 2 planes, circling and diving. Praed seemed to be fighting, at any rate. As he watched, the 2 scouts catapulted still higher, became tiny, almost imperceptible dots, visible only in the reflected light of the flares. Then Lance felt a shaft of ice along his spine. The 2 planes had practically hugged each other for a second. Then one of them fell away, somersaulted, tumbled down wildly, out of control. It passed Lance like a falling rock. And it was Praed's scout. "My God," muttered Lance, "he's been shot down." The next moment 12 Slavs were on him like a hurricane. Motors roaring, Lance stood them off, flinging a burst of lead here, dropping out of range here, looping, catapulting, zooming, phasing them with every trick he knew. A dozen times he sensed the zinging wrath of storms of bullets. A dozen times he escaped death by the breadth of a hair. Not for nothing was he called one of the best pilots in the service, second only to Hay. He bagged another of the Slavs, and began to think of getting away. Praed had proved himself, but had been killed in doing so. He's got the dope on Hill 333. Now for the getaway. As he whirled, another Slav plane, the one that had got Praed, dove down from above. And in the last second of the ghostly light of the flares, Lance's bewildered eyes saw the face of the man inside it. That face was Praed's. Praed, inside an enemy scout. Praed, firing at him. Praed, not dead. Lance was dumbfounded. He almost died just then, for he felt his senses stagger and relaxed his maneuvering. Praed! What? How? He couldn't begin to reckon it out. If the flares hadn't died at that instant, Lance must have been shot down. Luckily, they expired. Pitch darkness washed over everything. The lights on the Slav planes switched on. Their prying beams fingered the sky for Lance's plane. But Lance was somewhat himself again. He jammed the accelerator down, dove headlong, flattened out and streaked for home. The speed of the Goshawk snatched him faithfully from the jaws of the Slavs. He left them milling behind, left Praed with them. Colonel Douglas was waiting for him. Lance's face must have been a study, for the elder man laughed shortly. "You need a drink," he decided, and poured out a stiff tot of rum. Lance downed it with a nervous gulp and sprawled in a chair, the glass held weakly in quivering fingers. Dead silence brooded over the whole base. Even the muttering guns were still. One green-shaded light threw the maps on Douglas's desk into glaring prominence. Besides that, there was no illumination anywhere in the 'drome. Lance knew he had a thumping headache and that his eyes were lumps of pain. The glass fell from his hand and crashed on the floor. It seemed to stir the young captain, for at last he looked up and met the colonel's inquiring gaze. "Well?" The colonel was terse. "I saw Praed shot down," Lance mumbled, as if to himself. "And then I saw him " "Wait." Douglas strode rapidly to the door which led to the other rooms of the building. After glancing to right and left, with an explanatory, "Walls sometimes have ears, you know," he locked the door carefully again, came back, and said: "Talk in a whisper. How about Hill 333? "Tanks amassed there," Lance said slowly. "Yeah, I saw that, all right. They must be intending an attack on that sector. But Praed, what happened?" Lance told him of the scrap, how Praed's plane had apparently rubbed wings with a Slav and then tumbled down out of control. He concluded, "I figured that Praed was all right, that he'd proved himself, that he wasn't a spy as we'd thought. But the next moment I saw him in the Slav plane that had bagged his." His wondering eyes sought the colonel's lean face. Lance expected to see it express amazement, incredulity. It didn't, though. He laughed. While Lance gaped, the older man went to the delicate machinery of the radiophone in one corner of the trim office. He clasped the earphones over his head and spoke into the mic. "Headquarters, Air Force, Washington. Douglas, Base 5, speaking." A tense moment passed while his radio call was put through. Presently a green light flashed on the board. Douglas said swiftly, "Headquarters? Base 5, Colonel Douglas. Tanks massed around Hill 333. Enemy evidently contemplates full attack on corresponding sector of our line. They know a scout of ours observed it, however. Perhaps that will induce them to change their plans. This next is extremely important. The first step of the torpedo plan has been successful." For a while he listened intently, replying with short, clipped affirmatives. Then he hung the headphones up and turned to the bewildered Lance. Colonel Douglas laughed again and rubbed his hands exultantly. "What the hell?" Lance began. The other pulled out a drawer of his desk and took from it a small placard. "Do you recognize the photo?" he asked smilingly. Lance looked at it. It was the picture of a man in the uniform of a captain of the Air Force, a row of battle ribbons on his straight, khaki-clad chest. But it was the figure's face that Lance stared at. "Sure," he said finally. "It's a picture of Praed. But what—" "Not Praed," corrected the colonel. "Not Praed. Captain Basil Hay." End of Part B. Section 3 of Astounding Stories 14, February 1931, by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Werewolves of War, by D.W. Hall. Part C. "Good Lord!" Lance exclaimed without knowing he did so. "Praed! Hay! The same man! Then that was the secret. That explained things. Hay, the hero of the force." "You're entitled to a few explanations," Douglas said. "I'll give you the core of the whole scheme. There's no need to tell you that it must be guarded with your life." He drew his chair closer to Lance's. "Yes, it is true. The man you knew as Praed in reality is Captain Hay. You see, Lance, Headquarters was taking no chances with what I just called the torpedo plan. Every move had to be conducted with the utmost secrecy. Had to be. For the torpedo plan is, in some ways, America's last hope. Our base, number 5, was chosen as the center of activity, the base from which the steps paving the way for the plan would be taken. The 2 best pilots in the service were needed. You and Hay were chosen. It was decided it would be best to mask Hay's real identity. So, officially, he was sent to the hospital. In reality, he came here, under the name of Praed. Why? Because there's a spy somewhere. We don't seem to be able to track him. He's infernally clever. And if the famous Captain Hay was switched to Base 5, putting the 2 best pilots in the service together, that spy'd know something was in the air. Understand?" Lance nodded dumbly. A great light was beginning to shower him. To more completely mask our true purpose, the colonel continued, Hay was instructed to make it appear as if he were a spy. And it was a damned hard job. The real spy, whoever he is, and wherever he is, would thus be additionally fooled. For all he'd know, the Slavs might have sent another over to back him up. That's why Hay never shot down an enemy plane. Says something about his skill as a pilot, doesn't it? Never able to defend himself save by maneuvering. He's a great flyer." Lance could only nod dumbly again. "After a couple of weeks at this base," Douglas went on, "Hay was to cross the lines one night with you accompanying him. You, unintentionally, would thus occupy the enemy planes while Hay attended to the real business of the evening. And you did splendidly." "The real business?" Lance questioned. "What the devil was that? I thought the real business was to get the dope on Hill 333. "So it was, partially. But also to take the first step of the torpedo plan, which was for Hay to switch over to a Slav plane." "What?" The colonel repeated his statement, somewhat dryly. Lance's square jaw dropped abruptly. But, he exclaimed, "how the devil could he do that?" Colonel Douglas grinned. "By a very neat contraption from the brain of one of our most valuable scientists," he explained. "Hay's scout was specially fitted up before you left. While you were sleeping, in fact. 2 experts from Washington arrived with that batch of new recruits this afternoon. A tiny sliding door was cut in the fuselage of the scout and a sort of folding ladder put inside. It was motivated by some rather complex spring work, but the really ingenious thing about it was the powerful electromagnet at its base. It's rather over my head," he smiled. "I'm a plain fighting man, and sometimes it seems that scientists and not fighting men are going to win this war. But at any rate, it worked like this. Hay lures, or maneuvers, a Slav plane away from its fellows, and while you're down below entertaining the others, flies wing to wing with it. He touches the spring of his ladder, and it shoots out, powerfully magnetized, and clamps onto the steel fuselage of the Slav. The automatic control keeps Hay's scout steady, and the ladder is so highly attractive that the Slav simply can't get away. Hay crosses the gulf, taking with him the cord which controls the electromagnet. He forces his way into the Slav, shoots down its pilot, releases the pull of the magnet, and there you are, our best pilot in possession of a Slav plane, and clad in a Slav officer's uniform. Do you get the idea now?" Lance strove for appropriate words. "Gee!" he spluttered. It's wonderful. And to think I tried to start a fight with Hay. I wish I'd known before. But I suppose," he added, "it was best to let not even me in on it, to keep it absolutely secret." "Exactly." "And now what's Hay's mission?" Lance asked eagerly. Colonel Douglas's face became sober. "A damnably dangerous one, and a mighty desperate one. As I said, the torpedo plan, which Hay is striving to carry out, seems to be America's last chance. We're holding the United Slavs, but only just. We simply can't break their line or make any headway against them. And when they do unleash their big push, there's nothing to stop them. So we're gambling everything on this slim hope. American science," he continued, "has perfected a weapon which is called the flying torpedo. It's a ghastly thing, too. Damn it, I actually feel sorry for the poor devils it bursts on. It's a sort of riposte to their disintegrating flame. Picture a huge tank-like affair of steel, 100 feet long. Picture a few dozen of them. Picture them crammed to overflowing with tons of glycoscarzite, the most destructive explosive the mind of man has yet conceived. An explosive that can't be hurled in a shell and can't be dropped in a bomb from a plane. A pound or so of it, man, lays waste a square mile of anything. Even our scientists are a bit afraid of it. They've been trying to think up a way of unleashing it at the Slavs, and these flying torpedoes seem to be the answer. The torpedoes are purely mechanical. Therefore, they can soar to any height whatsoever. 20, 30, even 40 miles. All right. Now, picture a dozen or so of these torpedoes soaring over the most important Slav bases and headquarters, 30 miles above the earth, at night, of course, and absolutely invisible to the most powerful search rays. They fly without the slightest sounds. Get that? Well, when this squadron of awful death arrives at the exact point over the place to be demolished, the motive force switches off and down they crash. Imagine what will happen when they collide with the ground." Douglas, with Lance's tense eyes on him, struck a clenched fist into an open palm. "Tons of glycoscarzite, Lance. Unleashed, without warning, from miles above. 30 of these torpedoes, each 100 feet long, dropping down on the very heart of the Slav invasion. Killing, blowing to bits, rather, every living thing, every fortification, every tree, every tank, every gun, every flamethrower, every plane in a radius of hundreds of miles." "God!" came from Lance's numb lips. "God!" "But," and the colonel held up a straight forefinger, "these torpedoes must be guided from the place they raid." Into the silence Lance whispered, "And that is Hay's job?" "That," Douglas confirmed levelly, "is Hay's job. And yours." Their eyes met, held, and then Lance's clean young face smiled. "Thank God, sir," he cried, "that I'm to help strike the blow that'll free our country." Colonel Douglas answered his smile with a smile. "Lance," he said, "it's because Washington has put this job into Hay's and your hands that I know it will succeed." "It will." Douglas lowered his voice again. "This is why those flying torpedoes must be guided from the Slav's innermost base. In the first place, they fly too high for an accompanying plane to guide them. In the second, the power that releases them to hurtle downwards must come from the enemy base itself, to permit of no possible error. This must not fail." "But," put in Lance, "how do the torpedoes fly? What motivates them?" "A closely guarded secret, of course," he was told. "I merely possess a slight comprehension of it. I know that it is an adaptation of that discovery of Professor Singe 2 years ago, cosmic attraction. Eventually, perhaps, it will permit interplanetary travel. This use of it is simply the beginning. But it is to America's everlasting glory that a scientist of hers developed it. You know how a sliver of wood is propelled by the ripples of a pond? Vibrations of the water, really. Well, evidently there are somewhat similar vibrations in the ether cosmic force. Each one of these flying torpedoes contains a highly expensive, intricate mechanism which transforms this invisible vibration power into material propulsion. The mechanism is adjusted to propel the torpedo at such an altitude in such a direction. We possess no means of setting the machines to stop at a certain place and so tumble earthwards. That's where you and Hay come in." Hay is now, with forged documents, passing himself off as a regular Slav pilot. He speaks the tongue. 2 nights from now, you, Lance, keep a rendezvous with Hay at an isolated ranch in the Lake Tahoe country, the Sola Ranch, where we staged that big fight a few months back. Lance nodded. "In your plane is an instrument which is the kernel of the scheme. It arrives here tomorrow. It's a device which shoots an invisible beam 50 miles into the air, a negative beam, in sympathy with the machinery on the torpedoes. Hay sets this device near the Slav headquarters. The torpedo squadron takes off from a few hundred miles behind here, flying in the direction of the heart of the Slav forces. When they run into the beam, their motive power is nullified, and down they fall. Crash. The Slavs are wiped out. Our troops charge forward in a grand attack. The Slavs, with no armament, no reinforcing troops, no supply of tanks and flamethrowers, crumple. The invasion of America is put to an end." Lance rose. His face was alight, his eyes burning with strong, unquenchable fire. "It's great, sir, great. It can't fail. By God, if it takes every last drop of my blood, I'll help Hay put this through." Colonel Douglas extended his right hand, and Lance's met it in a firm shake. In the thick silence they stood thus for some minutes. Then, without moving so much as a cheek muscle, the colonel whispered, his eyes tense, "The door! Fling it open! I think someone's been listening." Lance switched his alarmed gaze to it. His muscles went taut. The next moment he had leaped half across the room, jammed back the lock, and ripped the door wide open. At the other end of the dim passageway he glimpsed a scurrying figure. Lance sprang after it with a shout to Douglas. Tearing out his automatic, he flung a burst of lead at the figure, but that instant it wheeled and sped from sight down another passage, and when Lance got there, no one was in sight. For a while he probed around, desperately, but could find no sign of anything. The base slept. Sorely troubled, he returned to find the colonel just coming back from an equally barren search. "Don't think he heard much," said Douglas grimly. "It must have been that damned spy who's been getting information of our movements. I'll have the guards redoubled to prevent him from getting anything through." He smiled at sight of Lance's anxious face. "No need for too much worry, Lance. He couldn't have heard much. The walls are soundproof and the door fairly tight. Now you go and rip off some sleep. You need it. No more work for you till Wednesday night. You're too important." Sleep! Lance only wished he could. But the thrill of what he'd just heard was too fresh, too new. The blood pumped surgingly through his veins. His brain whirled with the thought of the glorious enterprise he and Hay were aiding so vitally. Then, too, the night was humid and sweaty. For a while Lance lay on his cot, other sleeping figures to left and right of him, but his own eyes simply would not stay closed. Finally, after perhaps an hour of trying to doze off, he arose and, clad only in breeches and undershirt, wandered outside again, with a cigarette glowing in his mouth. The war might not have been, the night was so silent. Lance strolled lazily around the plane hangars, reveling in what little breeze there was. He seemed to be the only living thing abroad in the night. Then, suddenly, he flung down his cigarette and ground the butt out quickly, for he saw he was not the only living thing abroad in the night. Sliding rapidly away from the end hangar was a dark form. Lance crouched instinctively and crept forward. Who was the other wanderer? Not a sentry. They paced a regular beat closer to Douglas's office. Not another, who, like himself, could not sleep and had sought the open. This figure was going somewhere. It had a definite object in mind. Sheltering himself behind the hangar's bulk, Lance advanced as stealthily as he could. Coming to the end one, he peered around its blunt corner. 50 yards ahead, crossing a stubbly stretch of open ground, the mysterious prowler hurried onward. The night was dark, the moon troubled by ragged bursts of listless, heavy clouds. Lance bent almost double and left the shelter of the black hangar. Feeling his way carefully, he followed the other. Was this the unknown spy? The spy going to transmit the news he had overheard? Lance muttered a curse. He had no weapon with him. The spy, if he were a spy, would certainly be armed. But that didn't matter. It was merely unfortunate. He must track the other down, at all cost. For some minutes he crept on in this manner. The other kept hurrying forward. Lance noted a clump of brush far ahead. The figure was evidently making for this. And sure enough, as if acting directly on Lance's thought, the dark form entered the patch of growth, and did not come out on the other side. Lance broke into a trot, eyes wary and alert for sign of his prey. At any second he might be greeted by a salvo of bullets, and every fiber of his lean body was taut. As he approached the clump of brush, he dropped to the ground, and came finally to it on his belly. From a distance of about 10 feet he rose and charged. Expecting each moment to hear the spit of a revolver, he was more alarmed by what actually did greet him. Nothing. The patch of brush was empty. "Well, I'll be damned," Lance murmured. "Where did he get to?" He gazed around, bewildered. The growth of bush was about 10 feet wide. On either side the flat Nevada plain stretched away, empty. No figure was visible. Lance was utterly baffled. The fellow had vanished as if by magic, flown away into thin air. The young captain stood quite still, listening, probing his puzzled brain. Then, like a cat, he dropped to the ground again, and pressed an ear to it. For his ears had caught a tiny, betraying hum. A hum! There was a machine of some type near him. He listened intently. The hum came from the ground on which he lay. There had to be a trap door. Lance's fingers scrabbled around, and presently found what they looked for. He seized the ring which enabled one to pull the trap door back, and was just about to pull when he heard, from below, a voice speaking in Russian. It was, then, the spy. Lance grasped the ring anew, and, exerting all his strength, hauled the trap door back. A narrow passageway was revealed, lit by a lamp. The hum burst with doubled force on his ears. He plunged down, fists clenched, and half tumbled into a tiny room gouged from the soil. At one end was a mass of machinery, and a microphone hung suspended before it. And speaking into the microphone was the heavy-set form of a man in American uniform, his back to Lance. As the latter charged down, he rose with an alarmed shout and wheeled around. "My God!" breathed Lance. It was Ranth, Colonel Douglas's orderly. Ranth! His dark face flushed with fury, he came leaping from his seat. The wicked little revolver hung at his belt sprang out, but Lance's right fist shot forward, knocked Ranth's hand high, and sent the gun clattering to the ground. Then for a moment they faced each other, the hum of the radiophone droning an ominous accompaniment. "You!" Lance muttered. "So you were the spy!" Ranth answered him with a choked oath and leaped forward again. There were no niceties to that combat. It was a matter of life and death, and each knew it. Ranth would kill him, Lance knew, if he possibly could. And he had to kill or capture Ranth. Otherwise, the news of the torpedo plan would go through. Ranth would return to the base, and the secret of the hidden radio never be known. Another would be put in Lance's place, and when Hay kept his rendezvous at Sola Ranch, he had to win. No effort was made at defense, for those first few furious minutes. A veritable fusillade of hurtling fists stormed through the air. They each gave and took equally. Then Ranth's heavy shoulders bunched. Cunningly he feinted, then whirling, swung a vicious right hand smash to Lance's chin. Lance reeled, fell, seeing Ranth's hate-contorted visage dance queerly in the close air before him. The orderly clutched for his revolver, and Lance bounded up as if spring-impelled, nailed the other with two lightning-like jabs, and unleashed all his strength in an uppercut which sprawled Ranth in a limp, quivering heap. Panting, Lance surveyed him, then turned to get the gun. He felt the shock of thudding flesh in his legs and fell again, with Ranth scrambling on top of him. Steel-ribbed hands pounced on his throat, gouged savagely, while the man above grunted thick curses from his slavering mouth. Lance struggled fiercely, saw a curtain of black rush down. Desperately he hooked a booted leg up, craned it over Ranth's back, tugged. The terrible fingers loosened. Lance shook them off, rolled the other over, and leaped once more to his feet, right hand clenched and ready. Ranth staggered up. The young man measured him, pivoted, and smashed his beefy jaw with a clean swing that had every ounce of Lance's hard young body behind it. The orderly shot back as if struck by a locomotive. He crashed into the radiophone, splintered the delicate instruments, and slumped, eyes glazed, to the ground. He was out. Dead out. But how much had he got through on the radiophone before being stopped? Had he told where the rendezvous was to be, told the time and place, and warned the Slavs to look for Hay? Lance sighed, and was conscious that his left eye was rapidly closing, that a lip was split and his whole body sore. He slung Ranth over his shoulders and trudged wearily back to the base. He told his story to Colonel Douglas's amazed ears. Ranth, come back to life, was slapped in handcuffs, and for some time the colonel put him through a stern inquisition. But his lips were sealed. He would not divulge how much he had succeeded in passing on to the Slavs. "A brave man," Douglas observed grimly when Ranth was carried off to the brig. "But it's death for him, the same as it would be death for Hay were he caught." "I don't think he had a chance to get much across, sir," Lance said. "I was right on him almost as soon as he got there. You won't let this cancel our rendezvous?" Douglas's thin lips smiled narrowly. "No. You'll be taking a greater chance, Lance, but we must gamble on how much the Slavs know. You're game, aren't you?" "Yes, sir." Wednesday night came. Thunderstorms muttered to each other on the lowering horizons. Gusts of fierce, wind-driven rain slanted down on the dripping base. Occasionally a crooked finger of lightning probed the black sky and lit the whole sopping countryside with a searing, flashing glare. The night patrol had taken off. A single plane, wet and gleaming under the sobbing heavens, stood on the tarmac, two heavily coated figures before it. Presently 3 more figures, carrying some bulky black object carefully between them, emerged from one of the buildings. Tenderly they placed this object in the lone plane, which had been stripped of radio outfit and gas bomb compartment to provide room. Then the 2 original figures were left alone once more before the fighting machine. Far to the rear, the heavy American guns barked in their regular nightly bombardment. "A good night for it," Colonel Douglas, scanning the sky, said. "And also a bad one. If only that damned lightning would stop." Lance, pulling on thick gloves, did not reply. The colonel consulted his watch. "What time do you make it?" he asked. "Exactly 8," the other answered. "Right. At 8:06 you leave. At 9 on the dot you meet Hay at Sola Ranch. At 9:10 the torpedoes take off. At 9:45 they arrive over their destination, San Francisco and the surrounding territory. And 9:45, if things go correctly, which they must, is the minute that ends the Slavish invasion of America. At 10 minutes to 10, 5 minutes after the torpedoes strike, our troops charge forward in general attack. God be with you, Lance. The fate of America is resting on your shoulders tonight. Remember." "I'm remembering." Colonel Douglas looked at the young man's grim, set face, looked at his lithe, clean-limbed figure and his steady black eyes, which burned with a purposeful fire, and the colonel smiled. "We'll win," he said. An orderly sped from his office, saluted, and rapped crisply, "Order just received from Washington, sir. To proceed." Lance clasped Douglas's hand and leaped into the snug, enclosed cockpit. The 4 motors bellowed as the thin sprayed oil cascaded to them. The helicopter props spun round. "Go to it, kid," cried Douglas. "Spy or no spy, you're coming out on top. And give Hay a last handshake for me." And he swung to the salute. Lance extended his hand. Then he gave his ship the gun, and the tiny, streamlined scout teetered, roared, and rose with a scream into the dripping darkness high above. The torpedo plan had started. End of Part C. Section 4 of Astounding Stories 14, February 1931. By Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Werewolves of War by D.W. Hall. Part D. Lance hung for a moment at 1,000 feet. A crack of lightning lit the base below for a second, and he perceived the colonel's straight figure with hand outstretched. Lance grinned and gunned to 40,000, an easy flying height with his superchargers pumping and air rectifiers normalizing the enclosed pilot's seat. But what, he wondered as he stopped the helicopters, did he mean by give a last handshake? He was soon to find out. Behind him, in the fuselage, nestled the weird cluster of machinery which was the Singe beacon. It certainly did not look imposing, a mass of spidery tubes mazing round a bulky black box which was, Lance guessed, some new type of generator. Out of the top of the device sprouted a funnel-like horn, from which, on the adjustment of the beacon's control studs, shot the nullifying ray. Lance could not suppress a shiver as he thought of the earth-shaking cataclysm that ray would conjure from the infinitely high heavens. At 40,000 feet he was above the storm clouds, whose pitchy, vapor-drenched blackness effectively blanked out all sign of the earth. He might have been flying in outer space. Keeping a careful eye on his instruments, he set a course for Sola Ranch. He kept his speed around 300, wishing to meet Hay exactly at 9. But would Hay be there? How much did the Slavs know? How much had Ranth got through before he stopped him? A frown creased his brow. It was best not to puzzle over that question. Best just to go ahead, and keep going. At about 3 minutes to 9, he set the plane's nose down through veils of clammy cloud. This was the mountainous country, sparsely patrolled by Slav ships. Lance hovered cautiously over the furred mountain tops, getting his directions, shooting wary eyes through the magnifying mirrors in search of enemy scouts. He saw none. Satisfied, he cut the raw diesels, gunned the helicopter props, and dropped lightly down on the stubby field of Sola Ranch. To left and right loomed the dim outlines of the lonely mountains. Before the war, the owner of Sola Ranch had grown apples. This field had housed a few horses. It made a perfect landing place, secluded, misty with the clinging mountain vapors, far apart from the war. Lance felt like a prowling werewolf there, waiting for its ghostly mate. Rain was still splattering in desultory bursts, but distance muted the rumbling salvos of thunder. His watch told him it was 1 minute to 9. Now what? Hay or a swooping squadron of Slav planes? Lance stepped out of the cockpit into the rain, though holding himself tensely, ready to leap back again and soar away. He stared around and peered above. Was that a shadow? A nightmare flying bird? Or a plane? He grasped a hand flash and rapidly signaled his identity. The next instant it seemed the shadow wavered, then fell earthward with great speed. Out of the gloom and rain it came, an enemy plane. It dropped down beside his scout. From its cockpit came a few swift flashes of light. Hey! Lance ran eagerly over to the other plane, and out from its enclosed cabin stepped the man he had known as Praed. Wordlessly they gripped hands. Hay's thin, straight face wore a smile, and he met Lance's eyes keenly. Lance stammered, "Sorry, Captain Hay, about the way I treated you at the base. You see, I had no idea who you were." Hay cut short his apologies with a laugh. "Rot. I'd have been the same way myself." He glanced rapidly at Lance's plane. "Got it?" he questioned. "I'm a bit late. Had a hell of a time getting here without arousing suspicion. We'd best hurry." Lance nodded. They hurried to the Goshawk. As they worked, carefully lifting out the Singe beacon, Lance, in crisp, short-clipped sentences, told his companion of Ranth, the spy. "You don't know how much he got through?" "No," said Lance. "No." Well, we'll have to trust to luck." "You know the working of the beacon?" Lance asked. On the other's nod of affirmation, he continued, "What's your plan?" "Light about 5 miles this side of Frisco itself, just near the main Slav military base. Anywhere in that territory would do, though. The beacon doesn't go up in a narrow ray. It spreads, diffuses. The squadron of torpedoes will cover some 50 or 60 miles of ground, I believe. They'll utterly demolish the city, and every damned Slav in it." His face in the darkness went grim and hard. "And it'll damn well pay them back," he rasped, "for the horrible way they massacred San Francisco's population." The Singe beacon was in his plane. Hay turned to Lance, stretching out his hand for a farewell clasp. Then Lance asked the question that had been worrying him. "Colonel Douglas told me to give you a last handshake for him." "Last? Why did he say that?" "Because," Hay said smilingly, "I'm staying by the beacon to make sure that nothing goes wrong. I guess that's why he said it, old fellow." Lance gasped. "You're sacrificing your life?" "Of course. To save 75 million others." Then suddenly they both stared above. A roar of sound, of purring motors, of props, mixed with the chatter of a dozen machine guns, had belched with numbing suddenness from the low-hanging clouds. Enemy planes! A patrol of them! "God!" jerked Lance. "Ranth's warning got through. Part of it, anyway." He leaped for his plane, shouting, "I'll hold him off! You get away quick!" and through a veritable hail of lead sprang into the cockpit. Then, a cold pang at his heart, he sprang out again. A bullet had caught Hay. For a moment the Slav fire ceased, while their planes zoomed up to start another death-dealing dive. And in that moment Lance was at Hay's side, where he had fallen. "They got me," whispered Hay, a stream of blood welling from his gasping mouth. I'm going. Carry me to your plane. I've still a little strength left." You take the beacon. I'll hold them as long as I can. Put through that beacon, boy. Put it through." His brain a maelstrom, Lance stared at the crumpled figure. It was the only way. He heard the motors above come roaring down again. Desperately, he carried the blood-choking Hay to his own plane, propped him limply at the controls. Bullets spat through a frenzy of noise. Weakly, Hay started the Goshawk's diesels, and weakly into Lance's face smiled and beckoned him to leave. And as Lance, a grim resolve at his heart, turned, Hay's blood-frothed lips formed the words, "Carry on." Through the raining lead, seeming to bear a charmed life, Lance leaped to Hay's plane, hearing as he did so his own, with a stricken pilot at its controls, hurtle upwards. "Carry on, for the life of America. Carry on." 10 minutes past the hour of 9, a full 1,000 miles behind the lines, on the wide black field of America's major war base, a small group of men stood, surveying the awesome weapons assembled there. Row upon row of huge, dully gleaming, cigar-shaped things stretched away into darkness before them. There were only one or two faint lights to give illumination, and the night choked in on them, making them terrifying. They resembled, more than anything else, half-sized dirigibles, being roughly about 100 feet long and perhaps as much as 30 feet high. At first sight they seemed to be numberless. Then, as the bewildered eye became more sane, one could count them and see that there were, in reality, about 30. Their prows were stubby. In the port side of each a tiny trap door yawned, and standing by every trap door was the overall clad figure of a mechanic, waiting for the signal. The commander of the American Air Force looked up from his wristwatch. At his side was a peculiar gnome-like figure, a figure with hunched, twisted back and huge, over-heavy head. This was Professor Singe, and from that ridiculous head had come the germ which had finally expanded into the torpedoes arrayed before him. His eyes were nervous, his crooked face twitched ceaselessly. "Time?" he kept asking. "Time? Is it yet time?" And finally the tall figure of the commanding officer turned and rapped, "Time." An aide-de-camp raised a hand. As if working by some mechanical device, the figure which stood by each torpedo climbed through the trap doors, jumped out a second later, and came running to the head of the field. "About 30 seconds," muttered Singe nervously, eyes alight. 30 seconds for their motors to catch the stream. 30. Ah. For the squadron of man-made horrors had stirred. "God pity San Francisco," murmured the commanding officer, and stepped back involuntarily as the whole fleet lifted their glyco-scarzite-crammed bellies from the field and, as if moved by some magical, unseen, unheard force, shot up into the darkness with ever-gathering speed. "God pity it, indeed," chuckled Singe exultantly. "It'll need it." The C.O. sighed and shook his head slowly. "War," he mused. "And yet it's our only chance." For a moment he paused, seemingly unconscious of the macabre little form next to him, still gazing aloft at the now invisible torpedoes, and then muttered, "And God pity Basil Hay, who's giving his life to America, a glorious, unselfish hero. God pity Basil Hay." American flyers never knew of Basil Hay's last fight. Had they, it would have become legendary, for Hay fought a grim battle against two foes. One he could face and conquer, as he had conquered often before, but the other lurked next to his dauntless heart, and it Hay could not subdue. It was death. Truly Hay's fight, there in the wet clouds above Sola Ranch, was an inspired one. He fought almost by instinct alone, instinct 20 years of piloting had planted deep in his veins. He fought for Lance, for America. His eyes, glazing rapidly, could not distinguish the roaring phantoms that laced around his lone plane, but uncannily his burst of fire went home again and again, while theirs ripped aimlessly over the Goshawk's hell-driven snout. Of course it could not last. Gallant spirit alone kept Basil Hay taut at his controls. Spirit alone thrust back the ever-increasing surge of black oblivion that pounded at his heart and brain. Spirit alone sent the pitifully outnumbered plane corkscrewing in peerless maneuverings that baffled the on-passing Slavs and thrust 4 of them to the sodden ground in flame. Spirit that would not surrender, but had to. They could never have conquered Basil Hay in a plane. An ambushing bullet that caught him off guard did that. And finally, Hay fell. But he had kept them for full 10 minutes. 10 minutes, each one a lasting mute testimony to his unquenchable, unyielding spirit. He flung a last salvo from his hot machine guns, then, heart-numbing, jerked back the control stick and careened high. He slumped down. The plane paused, wallowing crazily for a moment, and then roared earthward. "Carry on" formed faintly on its dead pilot's bloody lips. Basil Hay had fought his last fight. 10 minutes. Lance hadn't expected that long. He'd thought Hay would die in a few seconds. The man was mortally wounded. Could not last. Nevertheless, minutes or seconds, he was entrusted with the Singe beacon, and it was his job and his will to put it through. He'd climbed the Slav plane up to its ceiling, driven it till it simply refused to go higher, and then roared on towards San Francisco. Each second he expected to see others come hurtling after him. When they did not, he knew how really great Hay's will was. It was an inspiring example. But his brain was tortured by a multitude of conflicting doubts. A patrol of Slav scouts had ambushed them. Just how much did the Slavs know, then, about the torpedoes? He, Lance, had to guide the Singe beacon. Quickly he reviewed what Hay had told him. Light about 5 miles this side of Frisco. Anywhere in that territory would do, though. The beacon doesn't go up in a narrow ray. It spreads, diffuses. Spreads, diffuses. Hay had been clad in Slav uniform, and thus could, with a certain measure of safety, put the beacon machinery on the ground itself. But Lance was in an American uniform. If he landed, he ran great risk of being noticed and attacked at once. Lance saw immediately that there was only one way out. It was sure death, but Hay had expected death, and so must he. His lips set in stern resolve. It meant goodbye. Farewell to the girl he'd left behind, farewell to life, farewell to everything. But not for a second did he debate the course he would take. Lance glanced at his watch. 9:30. The torpedoes were even now on their way, hurtling along miles above the earth. In 15 minutes they would be over San Francisco. In 15 minutes the Singe beacon had to meet them. He was not familiar with the Slav plane's instruments, but he judged he'd traveled some 125 miles. Was nearing the outskirts of San Francisco. The air below would be thick, probably, with enemy scouts, but his appearance should pass unchallenged, as long as they didn't glimpse his betraying uniform. He set the plane's nose down in a long slanting dive. Whipping through the clouds, the guarding search rays of San Francisco were soon visible. Lance saw a few patrols of enemy scouts. He clung to the clouds, decreased his speed, and began circling over the heart of the metropolis itself. 20 to 10. Occasionally a Slav plane flashed by him. Thank God they didn't challenge. Lance went still lower. Finally, at 1,000 feet, he set the helicopter props in motion and hung in midair, directly above the very center of the city. 16 minutes to 10. Now. In the American front line trenches, massed troops crouched expectantly. Clustered on every air base were flights of planes, each one crammed with bombs. Far behind, the Yank gun crews edged nervously up to their mighty charges and fingered anxiously the stubby gas shells which would soon be flung through the dripping night. And at base number 5, a very uneasy Colonel Douglas paced back and forth in his office, muttering, "No news from Lance. No news from Lance. God, he can't have failed. But why doesn't he show up?" He had not failed. Hovering in the plane over San Francisco, Lance squirmed round in his seat, reached back into the fuselage, and pressed rapidly the studs on the single beacon. A high, whining noise pierced instantly through the plane, and up stabbed the beacon, invisible, deadly, up, up, up to a thin realm miles above, where it flashed into an awesome squadron of terrible shells of steel. Shells that a second later wavered, staggered, and plunged earthward. And Lance tensed in his seat. From above he caught a tiny whistling noise, a whistling that hurtled into a terrific shriek, that roared ever closer. "Carry on," he muttered. Carry on. The words froze on his lips, for the world was suddenly consumed, it seemed, by flame and splitting, bellowing thunder. The American guns spoke. From every aerodrome, long flights of scouts and bombers and transport planes roared upwards. In the front trenches, the troops, still somewhat dazed by the earth-shaking explosion that had just tumbled from the far horizon, a horizon still lit by leaping tongues of awful flame, poured over the top, gas masks on, repeaters and portable machine guns at the ready, with a fierce cry on their lips. Before that avenging attack, the Slavs, their very spine broken, bewildered and confused, already turning in panic, could not stand. America swept to the Pacific and left death in her wake. And when she came to San Francisco, not even the sternest fighting men, still hot from battle, could repress a shudder, so awful was the devastation. The Slav invasion was over. In the rebuilt city of San Francisco there is a statue that stands proudly before the magnificent, gleaming City Hall. It represents two slim, straight-standing figures, clad in the uniform of the American Air Force. Their outstretched arms support a tiny one-seater Goshawk fighting plane. Below, as you know, there is a plaque. Men touch their hats as they walk by it. Flowers are always fresh at its base. On the plaque are the words, "To the everlasting memory of Captain Basil Hay, AAF, Captain Derek Lance, AAF, who in the War of 1938 gave their lives in destroying and devastating San Francisco, that San Francisco and America might live." End of Part D, and End of Werewolves of War, by D.W. Hall. Section 5 of Astounding Stories 14, February 1931, by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Tentacles from Below, by Anthony Gilmore. Chapter 1, Machine Fish. Full stop. Rest ready. These words glowed in vivid red against the black background of the NX-1's control order board. A wheel was spun over, a lever pulled back, and in the hull of the submarine descended the peculiar silence found only in mile-deep waters. Men rested at their posts, eyes alert. Above, in the control room, Hemingway Bowman, youthful first officer, glanced at the teleview screen and swore softly. "Keith," he said, "between you and me, I'll be damned glad when this monotonous job's over. I joined the Navy to see the world, but this charting job's giving me entirely too many close-ups of the deadest parts of it." Commander Keith Wells, USN, grinned broadly. "Well," he remarked, "in a few minutes we can call it a day, or night, rather. And then it's back to the Falcon, while the day shift sees the world." He turned again to his dials as Hemmy Bowman, with a sigh, resumed work. "Depth 6,000 feet, visibility poor, bottom 8,000, he said into the phone hung before his lips, and 50 feet aft, in a small cubby, a blue-clad figure monotonously repeated the observations and noted them down in an official Geographical Survey report. Such had been their routine for 2 tiring weeks, all part of the NX-1's present work of recharting the Newfoundland banks. As early as 1929, slight cataclysms had begun to tear up the seafloor of this region, and of late, 1935, seismographs and cable companies had reported titanic upheavals and sinkings of the ocean bed, changing hundreds of miles of underwater territory. Finally, Washington decided to chart the alterations this series of subsea earthquakes had wrought. And for this job the NX-1 was detailed. A super submarine fresh from the yards, small but modern to the last degree, she contained such exclusive features as a sheathing of tough new glycosteel, automatic air rectifiers, a location chart for showing positions of nearby submarines, the newly developed Edsel electric motors, and automatic teleview screen. When below surface she was a sealed tube of metal 100 feet long, and possessed of an enormous cruising radius. From the flower of the Navy some 30 men were picked, and in company with the mother ship Falcon, she put out to combine an exhaustive trial trip with the practical charting of the newly changed ocean floor. Now this work was almost over. Keith Wells told himself that he, like Bowman, would be glad to set foot on land again. This surveying was important, of course, but too dry for him. No action. He smiled at the lines of boredom on Hemmy's brow as the younger man stared gloomily into the teleview screen. And then the smile left his lips. The radio operator, in a cubby adjoining the control room, had spoken into the communication tube. "Urgent call for you, sir, from Captain Knapp." Wells reached out and clipped a pair of extension phones over his ears. The deep voice of Robert Knapp, captain of the mother ship Falcon, came ringing in. It was strained with excitement unusual to him. "Wells? Knapp speaking. Something damned funny's just happened near here. You know the fishing fleet that was near us yesterday morning?" "Yes." "Well, the whole thing's gone down. Destroyed, absolutely. The sea's been like glass, the weather perfect. Yet from the wreckage, what there is of it, you'd think a typhoon had struck. I can't begin to explain it. No survivors either, so far, though we're hunting for them." "You say the boats are completely destroyed?" "Smashed like driftwood. I tell you, it's preposterous. And yet it's the fact. I think you'd better return at once, old man. You're only half an hour off. And come on the surface. It's getting light now, and you might pick up something. God knows what this means, Keith. But it's up to us to find out. It's got me." His tones were oddly disturbed, almost scared, and this from a man who didn't know what fear was. "But Bob," Keith asked, "how did you—" "Stand by a minute. The lookout reports survivors." Wells turned to meet Bowman's inquisitive face. He quickly repeated the gist of Knapp's weird story. "We saw them at dusk last evening, remember? And now they're gone, destroyed. What can have done it?" For some minutes the two surprised men speculated on the strange occurrence. Then Knapp's voice again rang in the headphones. "Wells, my God, man, this is getting downright fantastic. We've just taken two survivors on board. One's barely alive and the other crazy. I can't get an intelligible thing from him. He keeps shrieking about writhing arms and awful eyes, and monsters he calls machine fish." "You're sure he's insane?" Robert Knapp's voice hesitated queerly. "Well, he's shrieking about machine fish with machines over them. I'm going to broadcast the whole story to the land stations. Machine fish. I don't know. You'd better hurry back, Wells." He rang off. Keith slipped off the headphones and told Bowman what he had learned. Hardy, staunchly built craft, those fishing boats were, born in the teeth of gales. What horror could have ripped them, all of them, to driftwood, with the weather perfect, and a half-mad survivor raving about machine fish? "Such things are preposterous," Bowman commented scornfully. "But the fleet's gone, Hemmy," Keith replied. "Anyway, we'll speed back and see what it's all about." He punched swift commands on the control studs. "Empty tanks. Zoom to surface. Full speed." The crimson words glared down below, and the NX-1 at once shoved her snout up, trembling as her great electric motors began their pulsing whine. The delicate fingers of the mast dials before Keith danced exultantly. The depth levels told out 7,000, 6,000, 5,000. "Keith, look there." Hemmy Bowman was pointing with amazement at the location chart, a black mesh screen that showed the position of other submarines within a radius of 2 miles. In one corner, a spot of vivid red was shining. "But it can't be a submarine," Wells objected. "Our reports would have mentioned it." The two officers stared at each other. "Machine fish," Bowman whispered softly. "If there were machines, the metal would register on the chart." "It must be them!" the commander roared, coming out of his daze. "And, by God, we're going after them!" Rapidly he brought the NX-1 out of her zoom to the surface, and left her at 4,000 feet in perfect trim while he read the instruments closely. A green spot in the center of the location chart denoted the NX-1's exact position. A distance of perhaps 40 inches separated it from the red light on the meshed screen, which represented roughly a mile and a half. Below the chart was a thick dial over which a black hand indicating the mysterious submersible's approximate depth was slowly moving. "He's sinking, whatever he is," Keith muttered to Hemmy. "Hey, Sparks, get me Captain Knapp." A moment later the connection was put through. "Bob, this is Wells again. Bob, our location chart shows the presence of some strange undersea metallic body. It can't be a submarine, for my maritime reports would show its presence. We think it has some connection with the machine fish that survivor raved about. At any rate, I'm going after it. The world has a right to know what destroyed that fishing fleet, and since the NX-1 is right on the spot, it's my duty to track it down. Rebroadcast this news to land stations, will you? I'll keep in touch with you." Knapp's voice came soberly back. "I guess you're right, Keith. It's up to you. So long, old man. Good luck." In Wells' veins throbbed the lust for action. With control studs at hand, location chart and teleview screen before his eyes, and 15 men waiting below for his commands, he had no fear of any monster the undersea might spew up. He glanced swiftly at the location chart and depth indicator again. The mysterious red spot was slowly coming across the NX-1's bows at a distance of about 1 mile. Keith punched a stud, and as his craft filled her tank and slipped down further into deep water, he spoke to Hemmy Bowman. "Take control for a minute. Keep on all speed, and follow him like a bloodhound. I'm going below." He strode down the connecting ramp to the lower deck, where he found 15 men standing vigilantly at posts. At once Keith plunged into a full explanation of what he had learned up in the control room. He concluded, "A great moral burden rests on us, every one of us, as we will soon come face to face with a possible world menace. Anything may happen. A state of war exists on this submarine. You will be prepared for any wartime eventuality." Sobered faces greeted this announcement, and perceptibly the men straightened and held themselves more alertly. Wells at once returned to the control room. A glance at the location chart and its 2 tiny lights told him that the intervening distance had been decreased to about a half a mile. The depth dial showed them both to be 2 miles below, and steadily diving lower. Charts showed the seafloor to be 3 miles deep in this position, and that meant... "Look there!" exclaimed the first officer suddenly. "It's changing course." The crimson stud had suddenly shifted its course, and was now fleeing directly before them. For a moment the distance between the green and red lights remained constant, and then Keith Wells stared unbelievingly at the chart, wiped a hand across his eyes, and stared again. Why, the devils are as fast as we are!" he exclaimed in amazement. "I think they're even gaining on us." "And there's no other submarine in the world that can do more than 30 underwater," Hemmy Bowman added. "We're hitting a full 41. A call came through the communication tube from Sparks. "Report from Consolidated Radio News broadcasters, sir. Aimed especially at us." "Well?" asked Keith, motioning Hemmy to listen in. Sparks read it. "A week ago, Atlantic City reported that 7 men were snatched off fishing boat by unidentified tentacled monsters. Testimony of witnesses was discredited, but was later corroborated by the almost identical testimony of other witnesses at Brighton Beach, England, who saw man and woman taken by mysterious monsters while bathing. Perhaps these same creatures destroyed the Newfoundland fishing fleet." His level voice ceased. "Tentacled monsters. Machine fish," Wells murmured slowly. "Machine fish." Their eyes met, the same wonder in each. "Well," Keith rapped at last, "we're seeing this through." He turned again to the location chart. The green spot, as always, was in the center, and at a constant distance was the red, showing that the NX-1 was hot on the other's trail. The depth dials indicated that both were diving deeper every moment. "Where in hell's it going?" the commander rasped. "We'll be on the floor in a few minutes." Here the teleview showed the world to be one of fantasy, one to which the sun did not exist. It was not an utter, pitchy blackness that pervaded the water, but rather a peculiar dark blueness. No fish schools, Keith noted, scurried from them. They had already left these waters, aware, perhaps, of the passing terror. They plunged lower yet. Wells was conscious of Hemmy Bowman's quick, uneven breathing, conscious of the tautness of his own nerves, strung like quivering violin strings, conscious of the terrific walls of water pressing in on them, and conscious of the men below, their lives bound implicitly in his will and brain. A thought came to him, and quickly he reached into a rack for the chart of the local seafloor. His brow creased with puzzlement as he studied it. "Here's more mystery, Hemmy," he muttered. "Look. There's an underwater cliff about half a mile dead ahead. It rises to within 4,000 feet of the surface. And that thing out there is charging straight into its base." "They must be aware of it," jerked the other. "See? They've stopped." It was true. The gulf between the two colored spots was rapidly being swallowed up. At a pulsing 41 knots, the NX-1 was closing in on the motionless mystery craft. "They're sinking to the floor itself," observed Wells. "Perhaps waiting to attack." The invisible beams from their ultraviolet light beacons streamed through the silent gloom outside, yet still the teleview screen was empty. Keith punched a stud, and the NX-1's whining motors dulled to a scarcely audible purr. "What is the thing?" muttered Hemmy Bowman. "God, Keith, what is it?" For answer, the commander dropped them the last 500 feet. The sea floor rose like a gray ghost. More control studs were pushed. The order board below read, "All power off, rest in trim." The location chart told a tale that wrung a gasp from Bowman's throat. The red and green lights were practically touching. The hands of Petty Officer Brown, the helmsman, were quivering on the helm. Wells's fists kept tensing and relaxing as he peered for a sight of the enemy in the teleview. Nothing showed but the moving fingers of spectral kelp. Then both he and Bowman cried out as one. "There!" End of Chapter 1. Section 6 of Astounding Stories 14, February 1931. By Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Tentacles from Below, by Anthony Gilmore. Chapters 2 and 3. Chapter 2. The Silent Ray. A strange shape had suddenly materialized on the screen, an immense oval-shaped thing of dull metal with great curving cuts of glass-like substance in its blunt bow, like staring eyes. A lifeless, staring thing, stretching far into the curtain of gloom behind. How long it was, Keith could not tell. At first his numb brain refused to grasp it and reduce it to definite, sane standards of size and length. The cold weeds of the seafloor kelp beds swayed eerily over and around it. From its bow, he saw, peculiar knobs jutted, the function of which he guessed with dread. Was it waiting with a purpose? Was it waiting, and inviting attack? A frightened whisper from Hemmy Bowman broke the hush. "Keith, the thing has ports, but shows no lights. What kind of creatures can they be?" As he spoke, the three men in the control room felt the unmistakable jarring tingle of an electric shock, and while their nerves still jumped, it came again, and again. They were conscious of a slight feeling of drowsiness. Keith gaped at Bowman and Brown, and then a flash on the teleview screen drew his eyes. There, against the blackness of its otherwise inanimate hulk, one of the jutting knobs on the bow of the mysterious submarine was glowing and pulsing with orange life. With it came the tingling shock again. It flicked off as they watched, then returned and went once more. "They're attacking, but thank God the shock was harmless," Wells said grimly. "All right, they've asked for it. I'm going to see how they like the taste of a torpedo." The two submarines were resting on the ocean floor with perhaps 200 feet between them. The NX-1's bow tubes were not exactly in line to score a direct hit. She would have to be maneuvered slightly to port. The range was short. The explosion from the torpedoes would be titanic. Keith punched the control studs, ordering the men below to assume firing stations. Then, while waiting for the NX-1 to shift, he studied the teleview screen to sight the range exactly. The black dot which represented the enemy craft was not directly on the crossed hairlines of the dial-like rangefinder, but shifting the NX-1 a few feet would bring it to the perfect firing point. But the NX-1 did not budge. Surprised, her commander swung and looked at Bowman. "What the devil?" he cried. "Did that shock?" He left the dread thought unfinished and leaped to the speaking tubes. "Craig! Jones! Weatherby!" he yelled. "Men, don't you hear me? Aren't you—" He broke off, wordless, waiting for an answer that did not come, then sprang to the connecting ramp and ran to the deck below. The scene, he found, halted him abruptly in his tracks. Every member of the crew was sprawled on the deck in grotesque, limp postures. They had been standing rigidly at posts, he saw, when the thing, whatever it was, had struck. Without a sound, without a single cry of alarm, the NX-1's crew had been laid low. The commander slowly advanced to the deck and stared more closely at the upturned faces around him. He saw that every man's eyes were open. Bending over one still form, he pressed his hand on the heart. It was beating. The man was alive. Amazed, he moved to another and another. They were all breathing, slowly and regularly. Were all alive. A curious look in their eyes staggered him for a moment. He could swear that they recognized him, knew he was staring at them. For every single pair was alight with intelligence, and Keith fancied he saw gleams of recognition. "It must have been a paralyzing ray," he gasped. "A thing our scientists have been trying to develop for years, and that monster outside knows the secret." He lifted an arm of the inert figure at his feet. When he released the grip, it flopped limply back to the deck again. "Keith! Come back! Quick!" Startled, the commander turned to find Hemingway Bowman at the top of the connecting ramp, his face distorted with alarm. "For God's sake, come back quick!" he yelled again. "Down there, the ray might get you." With the words, Wells leaped to the ramp and raced to the control room. He had no sooner made it than he felt again the queer tingle of the electric charge. He found himself trembling. Bowman's face was white. His words came stuttering. "1 second later, and they'd have got you. They got Sparks in his cubby. You see, the ray doesn't affect us in the control room because the Gibson insulation that protects the instruments keeps it out," Keith finished grimly. "I see." Just then a slight jar ran through the submarine. Coincident with it came a cry from Brown, the helmsman. His arm was pointed at the teleview. There they saw the enemy's mighty dirigible of metal was now within 30 feet of the NX-1. It had crept up silently, without warning, and spanning the short gulf between them, an arm of webbed metal craned from the other's huge bow, hooking tightly into the American submarine's forward hawser holes. As they took this in, the enemy ship moved away, and the arm of metal tightened. The NX-1 shuddered, and at first slowly, but with ever-increasing speed, she got under way and slid after her captor. They were being towed away. Kidnapped. Men, submarine, and all. Keith Wells mopped sweat from a hot brow and rapidly reviewed his weapons. He was sorely restricted. Through an emergency system, the NX-1 could be propelled and maneuvered from her control room, but the torpedo tubes needed local attendance. "Hemi, reverse engines," he jerked, himself spinning over a small wheel. "Let's see if we can outpull the devil." At once they felt the shock of the paralyzing ray, and then the surging whine of the Edsel electrics pulsed up, and in the teleview screen they watched the grim struggle of ship against ship. Imperceptibly, almost, as her screws cut in and churned, the forward progress of the NX-1 was slowing, the speed of the other being cut down until finally they but barely forged ahead. Slowly, ever so slowly, they were outpulled. Inch by inch they were dragged ahead. Their motors could not hold even. "She's more powerful than we," Wells' bitter voice spoke. "Damn," he thought desperately, while Bowman and Brown stared at the fantastic tale the teleview spelled out. Again the paralyzing shock tingled, an intangible jailer that bound them, more surely than steel bars, to the control room. To dare that streaming barrage meant instant impotence, and perhaps later, death. "Our 2 bow torpedoes," Keith mused slowly. "We're a bit close, but it's our only chance. The ray comes at intervals of about a minute. The torps are ready for firing. If one of us could dash forward and discharge 'em. Brown, that's you." The petty officer met his commander's gaze levelly. He smiled. "Yes, sir, I'm ready," he said. "Good. It'll have to be quick work, though. I'll try and keep the sub pointed straight. Wait for the ray, then run like hell." The first officer took over the helm, and Brown stepped to the forward ladder, waiting for the periodic ray to be discharged. The odd tingle came and vanished. "Now!" Wells roared, and Brown leaped down the thin steel rungs. He staggered at the bottom from the force of his impact, then straightened and raced madly forward. Through the drone of the motors the 2 officers could hear the staccato beat of his feet, but their eyes were glued to the teleview. Through clutching beds of seaweed the enemy submarine was plowing. Her great smooth bow lay straight ahead, metal hawser arms spanning the 30 feet between them. In another second, Keith thought grimly, 2 dynamite-packed tubes of sudden death would thunderbolt into that hull, and... Brown pulled the lever. The tubes spat out compressed air. A scream ran through the submarine, and the 2 steel fish leaped from their sheaths, their tiny props roaring. Over the narrow gulf they shot. The range was short, their target dead ahead, and yet, by bare inches, they missed. No answering roar bellowed back. Keith had watched their course, had seen them flash by the enemy's bow, flicking it with their rudders, but nothing more. "Why?" he cried, and as Bowman moved his hands in a hopeless gesture he saw in the teleview the reason. It was a jagged pinnacle of rock, which, just before Brown had fired, had been straight ahead. The towing monster had seen it and veered sharply to avoid crashing. The barest change of course, yet sufficient to avoid the torpedoes. Wells and Bowman were cursing savagely when the sound of Brown, racing desperately aft, jerked the commander to the ladder. He saw the petty officer at its foot. "Hurry!" Wells shouted. "The ray!" Brown grasped the steel rungs and scrambled upward, but he was too late. The fatal charge tingled. A peculiar, surprised expression washed over his face. His hands loosened their grip. For a second his eyes looked questioningly at his commander. A faint sigh escaped him, and then his arms were flung out, his body relaxed, and he slumped like a slab of meat to the deck below. Keith Wells saw red. Blind to everything, he was just about to charge down the ladder to himself reload the forward tubes when the grip of Hemmy Bowman's hand stayed him. The thing Hemmy was staring at in the teleview screen sobered him completely. The wall of rock to which the enemy submarine had first been charging had become visible, soaring vastly from the gloom of the sea floor, and the monster was towing them straight into a dark, jagged cleft at its base. "It's a cavern," Keith breathed. "A split in the rock, the lair of that devil, and we're being dragged into it." Chapter 3. Sacrifice. At that moment Keith Wells knew fear. Each second they were being hauled closer to the monster's dim lair. It lay there, dark, mysterious, fingered by gently swaying, clammy kelp. A hushed solitude seemed to reign over it, awing all undersea life from the vicinity. Wells turned his head to meet Bowman's eyes, and read in them a silent question. What now? He groaned in the agony of his mind. In a few minutes all would be over. Once the NX-1 was dragged into that dark cavern, there'd be no chance of escaping to warn the world above, of saving the submarine. What now? The question brought beads of sweat to his tormented brow. He, Keith Wells, standing impotently by while his ship, the pride of the service, was hauled inch by inch to some strange doom. Racked by these thoughts, he murmured tortured, jerky phrases, unconscious he was giving voice to the things that flogged his brain. "What can I do? I've got to save my ship. I've got to get back to break the news. I've got to tell the world. But how? How?" His expression changed suddenly. "That's it. That hawser arm between us must be broken." "Yes." First Officer Hemingway Bowman's clear voice broke in on the older man's thoughts with that one crisp word. Keith swung to find the other's eyes fixed levelly on his. "You're right, Keith. The hawser arm must be broken. With a depth charge, of course. It's the only way. To attach a depth charge," he continued evenly, "a man must leave the ship. You can't, Keith. It will be me." The commander did not speak. "I'll put on a sea suit," Hemmy went on quickly, eyes lighting. "You tip the submarine and I'll slide out the conning tower exit port on the lee side, so they can't see me, and worm forward through the kelp. We're almost holding them even. That'll be easy. I'll be protected from the paralyzing shock until the last second, and it may not get me outside. That'll have to be chanced. The hawser arm's only some 10 feet above the seafloor. I can reach it with a hook on the charge." He paused. "I'll attach it, and when it bursts I'll try to get back and grab that ring on the midships exit port, and you can let me in when we get to the surface." But if I take too long, Keith, if I miss, you beat it without me. You understand? Beat it." He gazed straight at his friend. "Understand, Keith?" Commander Keith Wells bowed his head in acquiescence. He was afraid that if he met Hemmy Bowman's steady eyes, he'd make a fool of himself. Hemmy glanced at the screen once more, shivering as he saw how near the black cavern was. Then he moved rapidly, playing the cards carefully for his gamble with death. He had to. The trumps were in the other hand. From the locker where their sea suits were stowed he grabbed his own, and with quick fingers ripped the slides and fitted it on. A sheath of yellow lesto fabric, its weighted feet and gleaming casque, transformed his slim figure into a giant such as might stalk through a nightmare. Built cunningly into the helmet was a tiny radio transmitter and receiver, with a range of a quarter mile. Hugging to the shoulders, inside nestled the air-making mechanism, its tiny generators already in motion. Around the helmet was fastened a small, removable undersea light. The wrists of the suit were very flexible, permitting the freest motion. Once in the suit, Hemmy smiled through the still-opened face shield. "Got the depth charge ready, Keith? Make it fast. That cavern's near. Good." Silently, the commander fitted the black bomb to his friend's shoulders. It was timed to fire a minute after being set. A long wire hook craned from its top, and this hook Bowman would fasten on the hawser arm. "Without sparks, I guess I'll have to communicate with you through portable," Keith said, and quickly donned one of the tiny portable sets. "Right. Ready, Keith." Bowman started his awkward, crawling progress up the ladder into the conning tower just above, Keith helping him from behind. When they stood before the exit port on the lee side, Wells shot back its bolts and the door swung open, revealing the black emptiness of the water chamber. The commander gazed for a second into Bowman's eyes. The moment had come. Keith turned his head away, felt a hand grip his. He wrung it tightly. Bowman clumped into the chamber. The commander closed and locked the door, and he heard the streaming water pour in as Hemmy turned the valve. Then Wells sped down the ladder and tilted the diving and course rudders of the submarine. She swayed daintily over to port. Held there. A moment later the recurring electric tingle brushed him. Had the enemy seen Bowman leave? Had the ray struck him down? He glared into the teleview. Thank God, he breathed, for Hemmy had already slid down the NX-1's smooth hull and was safe on the seafloor beside her. "Everything right?" Wells asked, speaking into the microphone of his portable. "All okay," came the answer. "Going forward now. Kelp thick as hell." Keith's eyes bored at the screen. This misshapen monster who was his friend. Almost obscured by bands of thick-leaved kelp, the yellow form moved, hands clearing a pathway through the weeds. Slowly but surely he made for the bow of the submersible. "Hard going, Keith. God, the cavern's right ahead." It was ghostly to hear Hemmy's warm voice from the lifeless solitude outside. Breath coming quickly, Wells watched the silent scene, the cleft in the wall of rock overshadowing everything now. The diver fought ahead, gaining inch by inch. Now, save for occasional clumps of weed, he was exposed to the enemy. Now the last desperate gauntlet was reached. Keith felt his blood pound hotly. "I'm gaining, Keith. Gaining." Bowman had little breath for speech. His tiny form battled on, now sinking from sight as he dropped into some masked gully, now wrestling slowly with great swaying strands of kelp, but always struggling ahead. "I'm at the bow, Keith. The hawser arm's right in our mooring holes. I'll go halfway before fastening the charge. Any signs of life from the devil?" "None yet, Hemmy. But go slow. Hide all you can, old man, for God's sake." Right beneath the metal arm, Bowman's dwarfed figure crept doggedly ahead. Forward, inch by breathless inch. Kelp thickened, washed away. The two hulking submersibles, captor and captive, surged onward, but just a little faster went the valiant figure with the black charge on its back. The towing monster had its snout in the cavern. The darkness thickened. Bowman was quarter way. He plunged desperately. Halfway. "I'm there, Keith. Now for it." "Oh, God!" Wells cried. "They see you! They're coming!" For he had seen strange shapes leaving the enemy submarine. and at that same moment Bowman saw them too. They came like the blink of a dark eye from a door that had quickly slid open in the mysterious ship's bow. As tall as a man they were, and there were two of them, though at first the nature of their bodies merged with the wreathing kelp made them seem like a dozen. Bowman stared at them, hypnotized with fear. His legs and arms went dead, and his whole gallant spirit seemed to slump into lifeless clay. Now he knew why the fishermen had shrieked machine fish. Each one of them had 8 tapering arms, 8 restless tentacles. These were octopi, most hideous scavengers of the ocean floor, and not only octopi, but octopi sheathed in metal-scaled armor. As they came closer, he realized this preposterous fact. The dark substance of their writhing tentacles was not flesh. It was a coat of metal scales, and the fat central mass which held their eyes and vital organs and beaked jaw, this mass was completely enveloped by a globe of glass. From inside he could see the great eyes staring at him. The monsters came towards him quite slowly, obviously wary, advancing over the sea floor in what was a hideous mockery of walking, their forward tentacles outstretched. With a sob, Hemmy Bowman pulled himself from his trance. He glanced back at the NX-1. He still had time to retreat. He might be able to get back inside before these monsters seized him. But that meant abandoning his job, and already his own submarine was nosing into the cavern. The choice between the octopi and retreat stared him in the face. He pulled himself together and jerked his arms back into action. Eyes bulging, Keith Wells peered at the dim teleview screen. He saw the creatures approaching Hemmy, and then, suddenly, he remembered his radiophone. "Hemmy, come back, for God's sake!" he cried. "Come back while you can. It's hopeless." But Bowman had already seized the depth charge from his back and hooked it on the hawser arm above. Immediately, with that action, all caution fled from the approaching monsters. Their tentacles whipped furiously, and in a great arc they sprang for the tiny figure of the diver. With a deep breath, Hemmy staggered forward to meet them. "Keith," he gasped, "I'll try to hold him away from the charge. When it bursts, zoom. Zoom like hell to the surface." And then the tentacles had him. Keith watched, cursing his impotence to help. Hemmy had no weapon. He was trying to hold them back by the weight of his body. He reached out and grasped a tentacle and hugged it to him, shoving forward with all his puny strength. But all his effort was as nothing. One of the octopi writhed past him and darted into the depth charge. Its tentacles tugged at the bomb, pulled furiously. The time charge exploded. The NX-1 rocked like a quivering reed. Wells was knocked violently to the floor. A vast roar smote his eardrums. When he staggered to his feet, he found that the octopus that was pulling at the charge had disappeared, blown into fragments of flesh and metal. But the hawser arm was broken. The NX-1, free, shot back a full 50 feet under the pull of her reversed screws. A cry echoed in her commander's ears. "Go back, Keith! Go like hell!" He saw the remaining octopus lift Bowman and whip to the exit port of its submarine. The lids slid into place, closing on the monster and his friend, and the enemy ship vanished into the black cavern. Once clear of the opening, Keith set his motors full forward and brought the diving rudders up. Quickly the ship sped from the haunted sea floor to the sun-warmed surface. A last thin call rang in his radiophone. "They've got me inside, Keith. It's dark and filled with water. I can't see anything, but I guess we're going through the cavern. Forget about me, old boy. So long. So—" The voice was abruptly cut off. Keith ripped the instrument from his head. Then, face white and drawn, he ran to the radio cubby. Standing over Sparks' inert body, he put through a call to Robert Knapp on the Falcon. "Knapp," he said harshly, "this is Wells. I'll be with you in a few minutes. Yes, I'll tell you the whole story later. But get this now. Have the day shift all ready to take over the submarine by the time I pull alongside." He said no more just then, but rang off. And looking back, he muttered savagely, "But I'll be back, Hemmy. I'll be back." End of chapters 2 and 3. Section 7 of Astounding Stories 14, February 1931. By Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Tentacles from Below by Anthony Gilmore. Chapters 4 and 5. Chapter 4. In the Cavern. That's the story, Knapp. They got Bowman, and I had to run away. Their ship disappeared into the cavern. I've got a hunch, though, that it's not just a cavern, but a tunnel leading through to some underwater world. That series of subsea earthquakes probably opened it up, and now these devil octopi are free to pour out. I've got to find out what's what, and that's why I'm going down again as soon as the torpedo system's ready. Keith and Robert Knapp were in the Falcon's chart room. On the table before them lay a broad white map with a cross mark indicating the position of the mysterious dark cavern. Wells was striding up and down like a caged tiger in his impatience to be off. Every other minute he glared down to where the NX-1 lay alongside. On her conning tower stood the tall, blond-haired figure of Graham, the first officer of the day shift, supervising the final details of the work of installing a system of jury controls whereby the submarine's torpedoes could be fired from her control room. Keith stopped short and faced Knapp. "It won't be so one-sided this time, Bob," he promised. "You see, when the location chart shows the enemy ship, I'll rush all men into the control room, where the paralyzing ray can't harm them. I don't know but what they have in other weapons, but I'm gambling on getting my torps in first. They've killed Bowman. They've ravaged a whole fishing fleet. They're free to emerge from their hole and maraud every ocean on the globe. They've got to be stopped. And since I'm armed and have the only submarine on the spot, I've got to do it. I know how to fight them now." Captain Robert Knapp's sense of things was badly disordered. He had just heard a story which his common sense told him couldn't be true, but which the evidence of his eyes had grimly authenticated. He had seen 15 men slung aboard his ship from the NX-1's silent hull, men stretched in grotesque, limp attitudes, men struck down by a paralyzing ray. Why, no nation on Earth had developed rays for warfare. Yet a crew of helpless men was even then in the sickbay, receiving attention in the hope that they might recover. "You're going right through that cavern, then, Wells?" he asked incredulously. "You're going to investigate what lies beyond?" "Nothing else. And I won't come out till I've blown that octopi ship to pieces." "It sounds preposterous," Knapp murmured, shaking his head. "Octopi, you say, and clad in metal suits, running a submarine more powerful than the NX-1. Armed with a ray, a paralyzing ray. I can't conceive." "You've seen the men. Knapp, if I were you, I'd swing my 8-inchers out, bring up the plane catapult, and keep the deck torpedo tubes loaded and ready. It's best to be prepared. God knows what's going on undersea these days." First Officer Graham appeared at the door. "Work finished, sir," he said. "Ready to cast off." "Thank heaven," Wells muttered, and stretched out his hand to Robert Knapp. "Broadcast what I've told you, Bob, and say that the NX-1 won't be back till everything's under control. I'll keep in touch with you. So long." And he was gone before the captain could even wish him good luck. Orders raced from her commander's fingers on the stud board in the control room. Crash Dive filled her tanks and put her nose perilously down, so that in 30 seconds only a swirling patch of water was left to show where once she'd lain. A brief command to the helmsman, and she pointed straight for the dark cavern marked on the chart. When well under way, Keith descended with Graham to inspect the new torpedo firing system, and found it in good working order. "Graham," he ordered tersely, "instruct the crew fully about rushing to the control room on one ring of the general alarm, and send the cook up to me in a minute or so. I'll be in Sparks' cubby." Above again, he instructed the radio man to rig a remote control sender and receiver in the insulated control room. The need for centering the whole crew there during engagements would crowd the room awkwardly, but at other times, while proceeding on their inspection of the cavern lair, they could remain at their regular posts. That, at least, was Wells's plan. He looked up and found the cook, McKegnie, grinning at him from the door of the control room. Keith smiled, running his eyes over the portly magnificence of his gently perspiring figure. "Keg," he said cheerfully, "I want you to move your hot plate and culinary apparatus up here. You see, we're all likely to be crowded in here for some time, and your coffee's going to be an absolute necessity." He couldn't resist a crack at McKegnie's well-known and passionate curiosity as to what made the thingamajigs of the control board work. And besides, it'll give you a chance to observe the instruments and perfect yourself for your future career as a naval officer. Much better than a correspondence course in how to be a submarine commander, eh? Cook McKegnie grinned sheepishly and left. He was well used to such jests, but he never would admit that his extraordinary interest in watching the ship's wheels go round was accompanied by a miraculous inability to comprehend why they went round. 15 minutes later, the helmsman's cry, "Cavern showing, sir," swung the commander to the teleview screen. The dark, kelp-shrouded opening he knew so well was already looming on it, and he was prepared. "Enter," he said, while his punched studs ordered quarter speed, ready at posts, tanks in trim. The NX-1 slackened her gait, balanced cautiously, and struck a straight, even course as she crept closer to the cleft entrance through which, some 2 hours earlier, the octopi ship had nosed. Screws turning slowly, she edged through the jagged cavern. Shades of inky blackness grew on the teleview and danced in fantastic blotches. The screen turned to a welter of black, threatening shadows, became a useless maze of ever-changing forms. Keith mouthed curses as he stared at it. Now he had nothing by which to judge his progress, to maneuver the submarine, save directional instruments and perhaps chance scrapings of the tunnel's ragged walls against the outer hull. The NX-1 was running a gauntlet of immeasurable danger, her only assurance of success being the fact that a larger craft had preceded her. But how far, Keith wondered, had that ship preceded her? How was he to know that it had gone straight through? There might be a dozen different turnings in this tunnel. The submarine could easily tilt head-on against a jagged rock and puncture her hull. There might be mines planted directly in their course. He might be swimming straight into some hideous ambuscade. The passage had to be made on the fickle authority of the senses, and realizing this, Wells took the helm into his own hands. Graham was posted at the location chart with instructions to report the red light if it showed. Down below, the Edsel electrics were humming very softly. The men stood vigilantly at posts. On their brows were little beads of sweat, and here and there a hand clenched nervously. All knew they were in a tight place. Otherwise they were ignorant of where their commander was leading them. Occasionally a long shivering rasp ran through the ship as her hull nudged the rough tunnel wall. Then the course rudders would swing gently over, and perhaps, almost immediately, another grinding cry of rock and steel would come from the other side. Then would come quickly indrawn breaths as the rudders swung again and the humming silence droned on. The scrapings came quite often. Often, too, the motors would go silent altogether, and the NX-1 would rest almost motionless as her commander felt for an opening. It was a tense, nerve-wringing ordeal. The silence, the waiting, the dainty scrapings were maddening. Keith Wells's skin was prickling. He kept only fingertips on the tiny helm. He was playing that uncanny sixth sense of the submarine commander. When it misled him, the rasping rock groaned out, scarring the submarine's smooth skin. Generally, the tunnel was straight, but each time he heard his ship rub against some exterior obstruction, his teeth went tight, for who knew but what it might be a mine? They had penetrated perhaps a half-mile, when Graham, eyes steady on the teleview, reported, "Light growing, sir." Wells saw that the screen was filling with a soft, faintly glowing bluish color. The walls of the tunnel became visible, and he noted that they were widening out, funnel-like. He dared to increase speed slightly. 3 minutes later he saw that the blue illumination was seeping from the end of the tunnel. They continued out. "Thank God we're through," he muttered to Graham. "You see, I was right. It's an underground sea, and we're at the top of it." For the instruments indicated a depth beneath them of roughly 3 miles. They were in, evidently, a large cavern of vast length and depth. The NX-1 continued slowly forward, 2 pairs of eyes intent on her teleview screen. Keith jotted down the tunnel's position, and the funnel-shaped hole sank away behind their slow screws. And then, upon the location chart, a faint red dot suddenly glowed. It was upon them in a flash. A small tube of metal, shaped somewhat in the form of the big octopi submarine. had darted up from below, hovered a second close to them, and then, almost before they realized they were being surveyed, sped back into the mysterious depths from which it had come. "A lookout, I suppose," Keith muttered, breathing more easily. "Couldn't have held more than 2 of those creatures. Well, the alarm's out, I guess, Graham, but it can't be helped. Let's see what it's like down below." They plunged steadily down, then ahead, and presently there grew on the teleview vague forms which widened their eyes and made their breath come quicker. Keith had guessed the tunnel led to a civilization of some kind, but he was not prepared for the sight that loomed hazily through the soft blue water. Strange mound-like shapes appeared far below, mounds grouped in orderly rows and clusters, with streets running between them, thronged with tiny spidery dots. Octopi. It was, the commander realized, a city of the monsters, a complete city like those of surface peoples. For several miles in every direction the water city spread out, farther than the teleview could pierce. Wells marveled at this separately developed civilization, this deep-buried realm of octopi whose unexpected intellectual powers had permitted such development. Perhaps, he pondered, this city was only one of many, perhaps only a village. He could but vaguely glimpse the queer mound buildings, but saw that they were of varying height and were filled with dark round entrance holes through which the creatures streamed on their different errands. He saw no schools of fish around. "I guess they've all been killed off, or eaten," he commented to the wonder-struck Graham. "Probably the octopi have separate hatcheries where they raise them for food." "But good Lord!" the first officer exclaimed. "A city! A city like ours! Down here, filled with octopi!" "Yes," answered Wells grimly, "and this city may only be a small settlement. There may be scores of these places. We'd better continue ahead now that we're here, for we've got to get all the information we can. I only hope these monsters haven't more than one big submarine. We can expect an attack any minute." The NX-1 pressed on. The city dropped behind. A breathless tenseness had settled down over the submarine. She was proceeding with utmost caution, her anxious officers alert at the location chart. The great fear that tormented them was that they might be attacked, not by one, but by a fleet of the octopi ships. Then, at the rim of the chart, a red dot appeared. It grew rapidly, charging down on them at great speed. The spot was large. This was no small sentry boat. At once the alarm bell shrilled its warning. The crew below left their posts and raced to the control room. With sure mechanical fingers, the emergency system gripped the valve handles and motor levers. Keith swung the NX-1 onto a level keel, straightened her out, and decreased speed still more. Giving the rods of the motor and rudder controls to Graham, he moved to the small lever which would unleash his bow torpedoes, and fingered it lightly. The NX-1 was ready for action. Scarcely had the men reached the small control room than the familiar electric charge tingled. They stared wonderingly at each other, half afraid. No one seemed hurt. One hand on the torpedo lever, Wells watched his charts and instruments. He thanked God that there was only one of the enemy. The ray's shock came again, and stronger. The red dot was practically upon them. The screen was still empty. Coolly, Keith slowed the submarine to a dead stop. The crimson stud came closer. And then he saw it. It was the same fearsome hulking form, the same curving windows, dark and lifeless. The same knobs on its bow, one now leaping and pulsing with the paralyzing glow. At a distance of a few hundred feet the octopi ship swerved to a halt, dousing the NX-1 with its ray unceasingly. Again those two underwater craft, so oddly contrasted, were face to face. And again the weapon that had once struck the American ship's crew down at their posts was directed full onto the NX-1. But it was harmless. It merely tingled, and did not paralyze. The control room sheathing held it out stoutly. The men's faces showed overwhelming relief. Keith smiled grimly. Now at least he had the devils where he wanted them. Now it was his turn to strike with a, to them, terrible, mysterious weapon. They had attacked, had failed, and now he could square up for Hemmy and send a pair of torpedoes into that ship of hideous tentacles. "Port 5." The ship swerved slightly. "Hold even." The enemy craft was very close. The NX-1's bow tubes were sighted in direct line. Her torpedoes could not possibly miss. This time, destruction for the octopi ship was inevitable. Keith Wells gripped the lever that held the torps in leash. "Wait!" Sparks, a bare foot from him, yelled out the word. Wells, alarmed, released his grip on the knob. The radio operator was listening intently, a circle of taut faces around his crouched back. He swung excitedly around. "For God's sake, don't fire!" he cried. "Hemingway Bowman's on that submarine. He's alive and calling for you." Chapter 5. The Other Weapon. Bowman! Alive! Keith Wells let go the torpedo lever. His whole orderly plan of action was crashed in a second. For an instant he stood gaping at the radio man, forgetful of the peril outside, striving desperately to hit on some way of surmounting this unlooked-for obstacle. The idea of firing on his friend, killing Hemmy Bowman with his own hand, paralyzed his brain. And in that unguarded instant the octopi struck. From the bow of the enemy submarine, slanting from another of its peculiar knobs, a narrow beam of violet light poured, cutting a vivid swath across the teleview. The huddled men stared at it, not comprehending what it was. They felt no shock of electricity, nor could they discern any other harmful effect. The ray held steadily on their bow, not varying in the slightest, for a full 30 seconds. And still none of them could feel or see any damage. Wells, however, gradually became aware that he was bathed in perspiration, that great streams of sweat were coursing down his face. A quick glance told him that every member of the crew was the same way, and then suddenly he was conscious of a wave of intense heat, which quickly became terrific. The control room was stifling. Before he could act, the NX-1 slipped sharply to one side. A sharp hissing sound grew at her bow, climbing steadily to a shriek. Long streamers of white steam crept along the lower deck and seeped up into the control room, and then rose the fatal sound of rushing water, water pouring into the submarine from outside. For the violet beam was a heat ray, a weapon surface civilizations had not yet developed. While the NX-1's crew had stared at it in the teleview, it had melted a hole in their bow. Immediately the submarine lost trim, and the deck tilted ominously. In the face of material danger, danger from a source he understood, the commander became cool and methodical. "Then forward and break out steel collision mat, and weld it in place. Every man. You too, Sparks and McKegnie." But, sir," stammered Graham, "do you want them to get us with their paralyzing ray?" "You'd rather drown?" Wells flung back. Silenced, the first officer donned his sea suit, and in 30 seconds the rest of the crew had theirs on and were cluttering clumsily forward. Alone in the control room, Keith battled with the unbalancing flow of water, maneuvering with all his skill in a futile attempt to keep the NX-1 on even keel. The men forward worked with great speed, spurred on by the realization that they were fighting death itself. But even as they labored, the submarine swung in ever-increasing rolls and dips. The great weight of water she had shipped slopped back and forth. Her bow went steadily down. Keith swept her forward tanks clean of water, always conscious of the immobile, staring octopi submarine in the teleview, watching them, it seemed, curiously, and not driving home their advantage with additional bolts of the violet heat ray. Despite her commander's frantic efforts, the NX-1 fluttered down remorselessly. The cavern floor rose, and sinking with them came the octopi craft, in slow mockery of a fighting plane pursuing its stricken foe to the very ground. She struck bottom with a soft thudding jar and settled on even keel. At once Wells released the helm, jumped into his own sea suit, and stumbled down to take command. He found the steel collision mat in place, and the welding of it nearly completed. A few feathery trickles of water still seeped through on each side, but under his terse directions, the pumps were soon draining it out. The weird figures of the crew in their sea suits looked like creatures from another planet as they rapidly finished the job. "All right. Up to the control room, everybody. Fast!" Wells roared. The men stumbled aft as rapidly as they could in their cumbersome suits. Several were already on the ladder. A few feet further, But at that moment the paralyzing ray again stabbed into the ship, and Keith Wells slumped helplessly to the deck. And as he crumpled, he glimpsed the grotesque falling figures of his men, and saw one come tumbling down the ladder from the control room where he had almost reached safety. Peculiar sensations, unendurable thoughts raced through the commander as he lay there limply. He knew his predicament. He wanted desperately to rise, to rush to the control room. Time and time again in those first few moments of impotence he strove mightily to pull his limbs back to life. But his greatest efforts were barren of result, save to leave him feeling still weaker. The fate that he had seen strike down Brown now enmeshed him. He was paralyzed, helpless, in the midst of his crew. After a moment, all sensation left his body. His limbs might not have existed. Sensation, pain, lived only in his brain. And there it was terrible, because self-created. He found himself sprawled flat on his back, his eyes directed stiffly upward. He could not move them, but out of the corners he vaguely sensed the other figures around him. Helpless, every one. And who knew if they would ever come out of the spell? Victory had gone to the octopi. Minutes that seemed like hours passed, and then a well-remembered voice sounded in the radio earphones in his helmet. It was Hemi Bowman, speaking from the enemy ship. "Keith! Keith Wells, are you there?" the voice cried. "Keith, what have they done to you?" And Keith, he could not answer. He could not answer that troubled voice of his friend, that voice from a friend he had thought dead. Again Bowman spoke. "Keith, can't you hear me? What are they doing to you?" "Oh!" For a moment it stopped, then came once more, thick with anguish. "Oh, God, what's happened?" Then lower. "If only there were light, so I could see what they're doing." The voice tapered into silence. Keith could picture Hemi, probably bound, giving him up for dead. Then quite distinctly he heard a clank at the NX-1's bow. The submarine jerked, her bow tilted up, and with increasing speed she moved forward, silently as a ghost. Keith thought he knew what that meant. The octopi ship had grasped them with another of its hawser arms, and was pulling them away. But where to? One of those mound cities? His brain was a turmoil as he tried to imagine what was before them, but all he could do was lie there and wait. The American craft was towed for perhaps 10 minutes, 10 ages to her commander, then coasted slowly to a pause, and with a sharp jar settled to rest. As she did so, every light in her hull went suddenly out. It had been bad enough with the lights on, but the darkness was far worse. The submarine was a tomb, as silent as one, and full of men who lived and yet were dead. Hemi Bowman's voice came no more to Wells. He was alone with his moiling doubts and fears and unanswerable questions, and he knew that every other man there was alone with them, too. As his eyes became partially accustomed to the darkness, he could distinguish vaguely the forms of the familiar mechanisms above him. A slight noise grew suddenly and resolved itself into a prolonged scraping along the outer hull of the submarine. At intervals it paused and gave way to a series of sharp, definite taps. Keith realized what those sounds signified. The octopi were striving to find some entrance to the NX-1. This, he told himself, was the end. The creatures would break through, water would rush in, and every man would drown, for the face shields of their sea suits were open. The dull scrapings ran completely around the motionless submarine, punctuated with the same staccato tappings. By the movement of the sound, Wells realized the octopi were approaching the lower starboard exit port, and as they neared that port, the noise abruptly stopped. Then for some minutes silence fell. Next, the commander heard what was unmistakably the exit port's water chamber being filled, and a moment later emptied again. The devilish creatures had solved the puzzle of the means of entrance. In the awful darkness, the inner door of the port swung open. A slow, slithering sound came to Wells's ears. He sensed, though he could not see, the presence of alien creature. An odor struck his nostrils, that of fish. A deliberate something crawled directly across one outstretched arm, and another across his legs, and above him loomed a monstrous, complicated shadow, which after a moment slowly melted from his line of vision. Panicky, he strove again to bring his limbs back to life, but still could not. Keith knew that in the darkness which their huge, unblinking eyes could penetrate, they were inspecting the NX-1's interior, examining the men stretched on its deck, feeling them with their cold, metal-scaled tentacles. Another complicated shadow crept back over the commander's line of sight, and from all around rose the slithering, shuffling tread of the octopi's many tentacles rasping on the steel flooring. Sweat from Wells's forehead trickled down and stung his eyes as he lay in that dark agony. There seemed to be countless investigating tentacles feeling through the entire submarine. One of them, iron hard, suddenly coiled under his armpit and lifted him lightly as a feather from the deck. Another snaked up and clicked his face shield securely shut. Keith heard other clicks, and knew that the shields of his men were likewise being closed. The commander was held straight out from the octopus's revolting body, and as he swung, helpless, he could see that more men were grasped similarly in other mighty arms. Dangling in the shadow-filled darkness, he was carried slowly to the exit port, and he heard the inner door swing open, then close again. Water streamed through the valves. It encompassed him with a feeling of lightness, a feeling of floating, as he swung at the end of the long metal-sheathed tentacles. A moment later a soft bluish glow burst on his vision, and he saw that he was outside. There was a long wait, and when the current next swung him around, he was dismayed to see that every one of the monstrous creatures near him was dangling on high 2 or 3 men of his helpless crew. The whole outfit was in the power of the devil fish. And then their captors moved forward with them on a ghastly march of triumph. But Keith Wells did not know that, crouched behind the instrument panel in the control room, shivering and sick with fear, was the plump form of Cook Angus McKegnie, who had just gained it just before the paralyzing ray had struck. End of chapters 4 and 5. Section 8 of Astounding Stories 14, February 1931, by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Tentacles from Below, by Anthony Gilmore. Chapter 6. The Monster with the Armlets of Gold. Hemingway Bowman's ardent wish, after he was whipped quickly through the round exit port of the octopi submarine, was for a quick, clean death. The horror and mystery of his situation had left him with one conscious emotion, that he was afraid. The worst had been when he was hauled through the port, when, expecting anything, he had been able to see nothing in the dark, water-filled mystery ship. Deliberate tentacles had stroked over every inch of his body, tentacles that were not metal-scaled, as had been the arms of the creature that captured him. It was then that he guessed the true purpose of the metal suits the octopi wore: to protect their bodies against the lesser pressure near the surface of the sea. Inside the submarine they did not need them. He decided that the ship was used for rapidly transporting large numbers of the octopi to distant regions, and also for a weapon of offense and defense. The intelligence of the cuttlefish astounded him. Keith had got away. At least he knew that, and he thanked God for it. His bold stroke had not been in vain, his sacrifice not useless. After the inspection of the tentacles, Hemmy had been shoved into a corner of the octopi submarine. He had felt cords wrapped around his body. After being thus secured, he was left to himself. He was utterly alone, except for strange, vague shadows that floated through the darkness. Shadows that heated his brain as he realized how many of the devilfish there were. Hours that seemed like endless days passed. Bowman concluded that the submarine had gone straight through the cavern and emerged finally into what seemed to be another sea. Dead silence filled the ship. What was happening he could only guess. The craft seemed to run on forever. Never once did tentacles brush or inspect him again. Finally the ship stopped, and a great round door opened in one wall. By the soft bluish glow that seeped in, Hemmy caught a glimpse of his surroundings, and his gorge rose at the sight. The ship was literally filled with a slowly waving forest of long, black tentacles. Weird instruments, unlike anything he had ever seen, were grouped around the walls, and before them attendant octopi poised, their hideous eyes fixed and steady. There were no dividing decks as in the NX-1. The craft was one huge shell. Then came furious activity. The door fell shut again, and the ship shot off at a great speed. Hemmy felt sure they were advancing again to attack the NX-1, and at once began to try to reach his comrades through radiophone. He knew that Wells would come back. Finally he caught a human voice, and heard the NX-1's radio operator shout to the commander that he, Bowman, was alive and calling. But when he tried to speak further, the American craft's radio was silent. And then, in the octopi submarine, had come a soft glow of violet. Was it a more deadly weapon than the paralyzing ray? In great suspense the prisoner waited. Silence. Silence. Horrible doubts beset his mind. Was Keith refraining from firing his torpedoes because he, Bowman, was on board the enemy boat? The thought stung him. He tried desperately again to reach Wells, but there was no answer. Were the Americans dead? Age-long minutes passed. Then the exit port opened and several metal-clad octopi swam out. Hemmy had a glimpse of the NX-1 lying silent and apparently lifeless on the sea floor, a gaping hole in her bow. As if to taunt him with the sight, the creatures left the round door open, and presently Bowman beheld the octopi open the NX-1's starboard exit port and enter. Later, the port swung open again, and he saw the monsters emerge, each gripping several men clad in yellow sea suits. That they were dead or victims of the ray was obvious from the way they limply dangled. The exit port closed, and darkness filled the octopi ship. Hemmy Bowman panted with the futile effort to break his bonds. "You devils!" he yelled in blind rage, exhausted. "Why don't you take me with them? Take me! Take me, damn your stinking hides!" When Keith Wells was taken from the silent NX-1, a host of astounding impressions swarmed his brain. Swinging lightly at the end of his captor's tentacle, he strove as best he could, with eyes rigidly fixed straight ahead, to grasp his new surroundings. He had, first, one flash of the octopi ship lying quite close to them, its hulk, as always, immobile and apparently lifeless. And inside it, he was sure, was his friend and first officer, Hemmy Bowman, a captive. He saw that the octopi submarine had towed the NX-1 into one of the weird mound cities. His own ship was lying in what seemed a kind of public square, and crowds of black octopi were swarming around it as he and his crew were brought out. Shooting straight off the square ran one of the wide streets he had previously seen from above, and on each side the brown mound buildings rose. Their details were hazy, because of the cuttlefish inhabitants who swam thickly in front of them. His captors started their march down this broad street. Great crowds of reddish-colored octopi clustered on each side of it. Other swarms hung almost motionless, except for their constantly writhing tentacles above, so that their line of progress was through what resembled a restless, living tunnel of repulsive black flesh, snaky arms, and huge unblinking eyes. Keith felt faint from the horror of it. Thousands of the monsters were there, all hanging in the soft, blue glowing water. And occasionally, as he floated almost horizontally in his captor's firm grip, his legs would brush the wall of clammy flesh, or perhaps one of the tentacles would reach out as if to touch him. The octopus that held him swam some 5 feet off the street bed itself. At intervals, the thick swarm on either side would part for a second, and Keith could glimpse the huge mound buildings, ever growing larger, with round entrance holes dotted all over their smooth surface, above as well as the sides. The march was ghastly. Their captors were taking them through the heart of the water metropolis, displaying their human captives as did the Caesars in Roman triumphs of old. The swarming crowds of tentacled monsters grew thicker as they progressed, and their tentacles began to whip more quickly, as if anger was burning in their loathsome bodies. Keith noted the menace of their sharp-beaked jaws, and the sickening sucker discs on the livid underside of the tentacles. As far as he could see, the swarms fell in behind the procession after it had passed, following them. Where? Just as Wells felt himself on the verge of fainting, the procession turned to the right and entered the largest mound building of all, a vast dome, rising the very center of the octopi metropolis. They continued through a corridor perhaps 20 feet high, from which at intervals other corridors branched. Held by one arm, and ever and again turning helplessly over in his horizontal transit, Keith caught glimpses of walls covered with intricate designs on a basic 8-armed motif. Designs of artistic value, that gave evidence of culture and civilization. The passage ended as suddenly as it had begun, and they came into the main body of a gigantic building. The commander could hardly credit his eyes. The place resembled a stadium, and was so vast that he felt dwarfed to nothingness. The domed roof soared far above in misty bluish light. On the floor, exactly beneath the center of the great dome, was a raised platform, and on it a dais resembling a very wide throne. Around the dais a score or more of octopi, officials Keith supposed, were grouped. Rapidly the creatures following the procession swam into the chamber. Monstrously large as the place was, the floor soon was filled with the thick flood of cuttlefish which swarmed in from many doors. Keith, held with the other captives just to one side of the hole he had entered by, began to think that they must soon refuse to let any more in, when, to his surprise, he saw the latest arrivals begin to form a gallery 20 feet above those on the ground floor, and when this was extended far back and completely filled, start yet another above it, and another, and another. In 10 minutes the mighty hall was crowded with countless layers of the cold-eyed monsters, each layer angling up from the central dais so that all could see. God, the commander thought, nothing but solidly packed devilfish all the way to the dome. A slaughter pit. And we, of course, are to be the cattle. Minutes passed. The throne was still empty, and the thousands in the amphitheater seemed waiting for an occupant. Keith wished he was able to close his eyes. The restless, never-ceasing weaving of the countless tentacles in the levels above made the scene a nightmare. Some waved slowly, others whipped excitedly, but never for an instant did one pause. The movements were like the never-ceasing shifting and swaying of the trunks and feet of elephants. In the dim glow, the huge chamber seemed to be filled with one fantastic, million-tentacled monster that stared with its 1,000 eyes down on the forlorn group of puny human beings. As if at a command, the arms of the octopi on the platform suddenly began to weave in perfect unison in some weird ceremony. First they swayed out towards the waiting captives, then they swerved slowly to the empty throne, then came back a few quick, excited whippings, and once more the long arms reached out at the small group at the entrance. This went on for some minutes. Then, very suddenly, a creature swam up from what must have been an opening in the floor onto the dais throne. Keith saw it well. It was an octopus, a giant amongst octopi, and Wells knew at once it was the ruler of the realm, the lord and master of the swarming galleries and the cities of mound buildings. It was larger than its fellows by a full 3 feet, and, encircling each great tentacle just where it joined the central mass of flesh, was a broad, glittering band of polished gold. 8 thick armlets that ringed the creature's revolting head-body with a circle of gleaming pagan splendor. Keith could almost fancy that a certain royal air hung over the monster. The huge, unblinking eyes of the king stared at the horror-frozen captives. One long tentacle lifted slowly upward, and their captors at once started towards the throne with them. The score of octopi on each side stilled their weaving arms. A battery of emotionless eyes drilled into Wells's paralyzed body. He felt faint. Unquestionably, the horrible ceremony was leading up to some form of cold-blooded sacrifice. The monarch stretched a mighty arm towards Keith, and as in a dream he felt himself lifted out of his guard's grasp. The snake-like tentacle gripped him about the waist and held him dangling like a puppet 20 feet in the water, while the 2 deadly eyes stared steadily at him. He was brought closer, until the hideous central mass, with its cruel beaked jaw and ink sac hanging behind, was no more than a foot away. Then another arm stroked slowly along the commander's helpless body. Once or twice it prodded sharply, and Wells felt a surge of fear, for his sea-suit might break. Deliberately the prying tentacle moved over him, delicately feeling his helmet, his weighted feet, his legs. Keith Wells grew angry. He was being inspected like a trapped monkey. He, commander of the NX-1, representative of one of the world's mightiest nations, prodded and stared at by this fish, this octopus. A great rage suffused him, and with a terrific effort he tried to jab his arms into one of those devilish eyes, but try as he might, his body would not respond. He could not move a finger. For a long time the loathsome inspection continued, until the monstrous king seemed satisfied. Wells was handed back. There followed an interminable period in which nothing whatever was done, as far as he could see. He was sure that they must be talking, debating, but no sound reached his ears through the tight helmet. All the time the endless motion in the swarming levels above went on. It became hazy, dreamlike, and in spite of himself the commander began to feel drowsy. The weaving and swaying was producing a hypnotic effect. At last the desire to sleep grew overpowering. Wells and his men were more than half unconscious when their original captors finally pulled them back from the royal presence and began a humble retreat from the throne room. Slowly they backed to the entrance. Keith's last drowsy glimpse was of a grotesque, gold-ringed monster on a throne, with a score of smaller tentacled creatures around him, and a vast haze of weaving tentacles and unblinking eyes above. They passed from the huge chamber. The commander felt delirious, as in a nightmare, but he knew that they were again in the long corridor, and that their captors were taking them further into the mighty building,